Welcome, everybody. Kula, would you like to introduce your SIG, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our BIRA event. We're really delighted to be here with you today. I'm Kula Haridanos. I'm based at the Open University. I'm a senior lecturer there, and I'm also a convener of the Educational Technology Special Interest Group. Our SIG is really interested in the applications and impact of new and emerging technologies in education, both in formal and informal settings. The event today is jointly organized with the Religion, Values and Education SIG, and I will now hand it over to Sally, who is going to introduce herself and also say a bit more about the SIG. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kula. Yeah, we're absolutely delighted to be jointly organising this event this morning. It's very, very important, this whole area, and our SIG, the Religion, Values and Education, is particularly interested in anything to do with religion, values, and the implications of that for our education system in all its dimensions. My name is Sally Elton Chalcraft, and I'm from the University of Cumbria. And we've also been joined by another of our SIG conveners, Heather Marshall. Heather, would you like to just say hello?
Hi. I'm based at Edge Hill University. So good to meet you all.
Thank you. We have another SIG convener, Esther Cummins, who is unable to meet with us this morning. But we're delighted to introduce David Lundy from Glasgow and his colleagues, Zhao and Lee. And we're looking forward to learning all about teaching for digital citizenship and the data ethics in the classroom and beyond. So this is where the connection between the EdTech SIG and our Religion, Values and Education SIG come together. So we're delighted to welcome David. David has been a presenter at numerous Religion, Values and Education SIG events in the past. So I'm going to hand over to David without further ado to introduce and give an overview of the project and the people involved in it and its aims and goals. Thank you very much for joining us, David and team. And this is a live event, so if you'll explain to us the fact that you've got quite a lot of live participants in Glasgow as well, very exciting. Thank you very much and welcome, everyone.
Thanks very much, Sally and Kula, for the introduction. My name's David Lundy. I am a senior lecturer here at the University of Glasgow, and I'm joined kind of off camera by a number of delegates in one of the phases of our research project at Delphi Conference. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I just want to begin by just bear with me one moment, sorry. I just want to begin by sharing with you an introduction to our project, the Teaching for Digital Citizenship project. This was part of a number of projects that were funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. There were essentially two main themes that the Research Council were interested in education at the moment. One of those, no surprise, is teacher recruitment and retention, because there's a teacher recruitment and retention crisis, particularly in England. But the other one is educational technology, because so much has changed in the past few years. I mean, I think in all honesty, a great many things have changed in the past sort of decade or more, but our understanding of what has changed has been greatly accelerated by the changes that we've seen, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And bear with me, I'm sorry. If we can all cast our minds back to that time for a moment, I want to kind of frame this in terms of one of the So back in 2020, there was an attempt across the UK to move all of what had previously been face-to-face examinations into a online teacher assessment mode, with teacher assessment then being augmented by an algorithm. And this created an absolute fiasco in terms of the inequalities which these algorithms seemed to create, but which in fact were pre-existing inequalities in the system. So in addition to asking teachers for their own assessment grades, what grades they thought students were going to get in their final exams in high schools, we asked teachers to rank their students, to say, okay, there might be 10 students in my class who I think are going to get A's, but here's you know, number 1 through to number 10. And the algorithm then scaled those predictions by the expectation that schools would typically get. So if that school typically only got 6 A's, then only number 1 to 6 of those teacher predicted A's would be A's, and then the rest would be kind of scaled down. Now, that obviously led to a lot of inequalities, particularly by postcode, by school attendance, and essentially the thing that both of those approximate to, which is poverty. What this essentially was an intensification and an unveiling of a pre-existing bias. In an important paper from back in 1996 called Bias in Computer Systems, Friedman and Nissenbaum talk about this issue of pre-existing bias. And there are lots of examples of this outside of education. If you start putting pre-existing data from policing, for example, into predictive policing algorithms that are supposed to tell police services where to send officers, where there's likely to be more crime. If that data already includes a racial bias or a poverty bias from the reporting officers, then the system, the algorithm, is going to repeat that bias, and it's going to say, you need to send more police into this area. And lo and behold, that means the police are going to arrest more people in that area. And therefore you get this kind of intensification of pre-existing bias. And this led to protests, it led to the scrapping of the algorithm, but it's also led or leading in a slow and bizarrely undying way to the scrapping of the SQA entirely. That's already been announced about 3 years ago that the Scottish Qualifications Authority is being replaced. There is currently a review, the Hayward Review, looking into the future of assessment in Scotland. In the Financial Times in 2020, there were calls from business for continuous assessment to replace exams. And again, this is a a replacement of a traditional in-person system with something that looks a lot more like corporate intrapreneurship. Pen and paper exams introduce a sort of what's sometimes been called this analog impairment. I've known cases of mature students in particular who haven't sat down with a pen and paper in a 2-hour, having to write consistently for 2 hours since they were at school, and the impairment that creates, the sort of synthetic impairment that creates, and saying you have to sit in an exam room for 2 hours and handwrite, it's quite an artificial environment for a lot of people if they haven't been immediately in school. And so it seemed like we had a certain direction of travel, but then some other things came along and maybe start to raise questions about that direction of travel. The most obvious one being the AI revolution. If we replace in-person exams that are taking place under conditions of controlled invigilation, with something that is more open, more authentic to the kinds of hybrid technologies that people are engaged in, how is that going to change their ability to do all of these things that somebody has nicely written for me. When I prepared this slide a week ago, it was satire. In a bizarre event of real life overtaking satire, in the space of that week, Gillian Keegan, the Secretary of State for Education, has suggested that AI can take a lot of the heavy lifting out of assessment for teachers. So we have this bizarre situation where we're at the same time worrying about students kind of using AI to cheat, and at the same time suggesting that the teachers might in fact be able to make use of AI so as to not have to read lots of repetitive essays. And I would ask the question, why are we asking students to produce repetitive essays if AI can already produce, digest, reproduce things of similar quality? And that brings us round to the project, which aims to understand what teaching for digital citizenship in secondary schools means at the moment. We want to find out a number of things: the state of the sector, how do teachers understand the aims, challenges and practices of teaching for digital citizenship. We're planning to work with teachers and with schools in participatory co-creation of resources. And that sort of begins with the event that we're having in person now, with the Delphi conference. And we also have survey pilot results, which Lee will be presenting shortly. It raises important questions. Where does digital citizenship fit? Where does it fit in the curriculum? Is this, again, we've got this this joint event with BIRA. Is this primarily a computer science issue? Is this primarily a religious, philosophical and ethical issue? Where does it fit within the wider life of the school? So by working with teachers and by doing participatory observation in schools, we want to understand how some of those processes are enacted. We want to understand, for example, how teachers engage with issues of data collection within schools, the pressures that data collection and analysis brings. The project itself is conceptualized in a number of strands, beginning with understanding existing practice, understanding the challenges that all of you face, horizon scanning future challenges, so bringing together philosophers of computing and information, people from the technology sector, to understand how things are happening in the future, so we're not blindsided by another ChatGPT. And to understand that existing practice, we've sent pilot surveys to teachers. We are asking teachers about their understandings of digital citizenship, and Lee will be presenting some more on that shortly. We also asked what's covered in the current curriculum so that we know where to look, for good practice. I think there's a lot of really interesting resources already out there. One of the challenges that schools face, particularly in quite a fractured governance environment, is knowing where to find those resources. And very often a lot of those resources are in the independent and selective sector, and being able to democratize some of those resources is going to be an important part. Horizon Scanning Future Challenges introduces today's event, the Delphi Conference, which tries to bring together teachers, policymakers, people from the tech and academic sectors. The Delphi method was designed during the Cold War as a way of bringing together some of these unfamiliar experts, as a way of understanding what a really unfamiliar player the Soviet Union was doing. So it's a similar method for trying to understand how the interface between the education sector and the technology sector can better be incorporated. A little bit later, we'll be bringing you into some breakout rooms with my colleagues Jim Conroy and Bob Davis. And these breakout rooms offer an opportunity for you to ask questions, to interrogate the research, to share your own practice. There will be a couple of sort of points just to prompt reflection. We've got a co-design approach coming up where we're hoping to get teachers to work with us and with young people as well, and also with a range of mid-level policy enactors, organizations like Parallel Histories, which is using technology to teach contested narratives in various contexts and try to mitigate some of the effects of social media polarization. Data justice, we're going to be hearing more from my colleague Jeremy Knox from Edinburgh University later today about data justice. And this is about recognizing the more structural aspects of digital citizenship. A lot of what we've found so far suggests that schools are just overwhelmed dealing with the immediate threats, of keeping young people safe, digital safeguarding as young citizens, but how are we preparing them to be critical producers and critical citizens of the digital space that we want for the future? Cross-curricular school-based research, we're hoping to work with schools, and we are looking for schools who are willing to work with us across the 4 jurisdictions of the UK over the next academic year in 2023-24 to understand the lived experience. And that's everything from the RE classroom to the IT lab to students paying for their school lunches using their thumbprint, which has become ubiquitous in some areas and is often something we don't really think about in terms of the surveillance threats and the data accumulation that brings with it. So this project attempts to bring together the normative and the more lived experience. So the philosophy of computing and ethics is an established field in itself, that it approaches some of these harms and inequalities that can stem from unequal control and collection and processing of data. think about that 2020 algorithm again, but also engages with questions like what makes a computer intelligent? What ethical limits and safeguards should there be for some of those autonomous systems? And at the same time, we're trying to explore this in relation to young people today. So we're conceptualizing citizenship in relation to digital citizenship at 3 levels. So the young person as a citizen now. You know, there's no way you can really stop young people from engaging in the digital world as citizens today and as citizens of their school communities as well. The young person as a future political citizen of the state. So how does this influence things like political polarization in future, but also the young person as a co-creator of this digital global space that they're going to go on and inhabit. The project itself seeks to work with the EdTech industry. We want to work with policy influencers, not just ministers of education, but people who work in qualification, inspection, in the sort of resource creation to support digital citizenship. And we want to work with teachers, teacher educators, and with young people. The Delphi conference today brings together those stakeholder communities for the first time within our project. Over the coming year, we're going to be carrying out communities of practice, working to co-create some resources to address the challenges that we identified today. And there are opportunities as well for schools to participate in-depth ethnographic engagement, having one of our researchers embedded in your school to help you reflect on your practice and to help co-create and test and pilot some of those resources. Thanks very much for your attention while we provide an overview of this very complex, multifaceted project. I think I'm already running over time. So unless there are any really pressing questions, I would like to hand over to my colleague Lee Shannon, who is going to give us an overview of the pilot survey data. Just get the screen share sorted out.
Thanks very much, David. I'm glad that we've grown matching beards to combat the rather strange lectern setup we have this morning. My name's Lee Shannon. I am the RA on the project. I'll be tasked with doing quite a lot of the field work here, and I'm going to present a little bit of our survey data on the pilot that we're running to develop what we hope to be a comprehensive instrument to gauge teacher perception of digital citizenship. So I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through a few of our objectives for the final survey. I'm going to take you through some of the demographics of our pilot participants. We're going to talk about their definitions of digital citizenship, because I think that's important to get a baseline. Some of the resources they use and what they think about them. There's some interesting results there. And then some of their concerns. I think that's really important, actually. The concerns section might give us some fuel for our breakout rooms. So we want this to be quite a broad-ranging survey of attitudes to digital citizenship teaching. So obviously we want to cover beliefs, practices, and aims, but we want to talk about the technologies, how they might use technologies, and what they think about future uses of technology. Threats that young people face online is quite obviously a big category here, but we also want to talk about ambitions, and obviously how concerned they are about certain aspects of the threat of online work and how we prepare our young people to negotiate those threats. We obviously want to talk about where, when, where, and how we teach. So where is digital citizenship placed in the curriculum? And obviously the resources that inform teaching and how they're used. So just give you a few stats to bear in mind when we talk about a pilot. It's quite a narrow slice of the sector, really, if we think about it. So we have 67 respondents here, but 72% of them have more than 10 years teaching experience. So a very experienced group, essentially. They're mostly teachers or subject leads rather than senior management or middle management. They're mostly located in Scotland, and most of them taught in local authority schools. Now, these were recruited from our sort of professional networks in religious, moral, civic, or IT, those sorts of areas. And there's a breakdown of our respondent subject specialisms. So a lot from IT, I think, because we're framing it as a digital project. The initial instinct, I suppose, is to go to IT. Surprisingly, not so many from religious or moral education, but I think, again, that might be to do with our sample. In larger sample, we might have more buy-in from that approach. But also, we are framing it as a digital project, so I think it naturally lends itself to the IT approach. So we asked our participants about their definition for digital citizenship, what they thought it was. And I'll just give you a second to read through that definition. So there's something that clusters around responsibility, conduct, and safety. This was by far the largest category of meaning that we can sort of block together in those responses. And I think also that we could call this, I suppose, the good citizen or the aware citizen, maybe as a category of explanation for this. It is about being able to identify online danger, and it is about, I suppose, negotiating that danger, but acting responsibly as well. And that was by far the most overarching category of explanation from our participants. The second largest is this, and I'll let you again just have a little quick read through those. So we put this as access, competency, literacy, what we might call the skilled citizen. So being able to negotiate all the aspects of software, hardware, the platforms they're using, the technologies. But also, if we look at the bottom quote there, there's something about a politicization, being able to negotiate perhaps your conditional access here as a citizen. Other aspects of these definitions that are quite interesting, and we've talked about this as a research team. A lot of the definitions come back to this idea that we learn our ethical and moral approaches in our communities and our families, and we simply transfer those into the digital space. And we've debated whether or not we actually require a different set of ethics and moral reasoning for the digital space. I'm not quite decided myself. There's so many differences, but so many similarities. So this is still a sort of a contested concept, I think, in my own mind. A lot of people were very honest, and they said, we don't really know what it means. It's another one of these buzzwords, and we're bombarded with buzzwords. So kind of has the ability to, as one person says, leave them cold. If we move to sort of looking at the teaching, the sort of resources we're accessing to help support the digital teaching for digital citizenship, we asked actually about 16 different resources, and here I've just given you a brief smattering of 5. The top bar, the dark blue, is if they've heard of the resource. The lighter blue, second bar, is if they've used the resource, and what should be gold but looks a bit washed out at the bottom is whether or not they view it favorably. I'd just like to draw your attention to the difference between that sky blue bar and the gold bar, the second and third bars. Almost ubiquitous, in fact, ubiquitously across the whole 16 examples of resources. It would seem that our teachers are let down by those resources. They have accessed them, they've heard about them, they don't view them favorably. And that's something I'd really like to drill down into when we come to develop the survey. Interestingly enough, if you look at Be Internet Citizens, less people have heard of it than actually used it. So maybe that was a long day that day for our participants, or maybe we need to have a look at how we might frame that question again. So it is interesting though that the resources are there, but maybe their expectations are not being met. Obviously we have to be careful with a small pilot group. Next, we asked about their top topics of concern. And I'd like you just to look through that list and maybe just say to yourself, well, what is my top? What's the one I'm most concerned about? And what's the one I might be least concerned about? So just take a little moment to decide. Okay, so not a big surprise, cyberbullying, right up there for our participants. So 54% ranked that as a top 1 or 2 concern. 84% of the people had it in their top 5. 52% said we're doing enough in schools. And this, I think, becomes important when we look at other concerns. Very similarly, oh yeah, sorry, there's where the issue is, they feel the issue is addressed. Very similarly, the sharing of or the pressure to share or access to inappropriate images, right up there with cyberbullying. These are the top 2 major concerns. 51% in the top 1 or 2 of their concerns, 85% in the top 5. So these are really on the agenda, you know. If we look at that, 48% said the school are doing enough to address the issue. So there are anxieties about it, but roughly 50% are saying, well, we're doing something about that. Now, this surprises me. Maybe it was because I'm sort of paranoid as a person, but surveillance was one of the really lowest concerns here. We think no participant ranked surveillance as a top concern, only 19% in their top 5. And if you look at that, that's mostly loaded into the least concern at 0.5. Interestingly, though, you can see that sort of drop in how they're saying the school is addressed. At 38% said they feel they're doing enough. That leaves the other 62% feeling we're not doing enough about that. So it might not be in the concerns, it might not be the item of focus, but it's actually then leading to some low-key anxiety or distal anxiety, I think, about how that is being tackled in the school. And the same goes for AI, this is a surprising result, really, considering the media scrum around AI and various high-profile issues that we're discussing in the news these days. So if you look at it, no one ranked AI as their top concern, and 13% had it in their top 5. Again, lower down that list in position 5. 29% said the school is doing enough to address the issue. So if we consider the other 71% are saying, it's not really important to us, it's not really on the agenda, but we're low-key worried about this. There's anxiety building around this. Now, we kind of consider as a group what the reasons might be for that. And David alluded to it in his introduction. There's immediate safeguarding concerns, which seems to take the focus. You can't be focused on all things all the time. Cyberbullying, the inappropriate images, extremism, radicalization. But there are we can divide what we've asked our participants about into long-term structural ethical issues that are perhaps less pressing, don't present immediate danger, but nonetheless more important to some of our concepts for teaching for digital citizenship. So how would we like to develop these ideas? We would like to obviously look at the different subject specialisms and see how they approach that. We have a tantalizing glimpse of differences happening between computing and IT focused areas and the humanities areas. Not strong enough in a pilot for me to make any pronouncement on now, but you can see roughly that maybe those IT areas would be interested in the longer term structural, with the humanities sort of dealing with the more safeguarding issues, the immediate issues. We like to look at it across 4 nations and the types of school, because that'd be, you know, sort of interesting for the analysis. But I think we spoke about this as a research team. If we look at what we're calling those immediate concerns, they are symptomatic of broader issues. If all young people were fully prepared to negotiate some of those dangers, maybe those concerns would fade a little. If we were, you know, really successful in providing that ethical, moral reasoning and applying that to the digital world, then maybe we would be less concerned. Maybe there would be less concern with those immediate dangers. One of the issues, I suppose, about the long-term structural ethical dimensions is that there's massive uncertainty everywhere about this. I'm not sure if anybody caught the Senate hearing on AI last week. We had the head of OpenAI and one of the VPs of IBM asking the Senate for regulation. Senators are just flabbergasted by this. You're asking us for regulation. But in a way, that's really symptomatic of the fact that none of us have a key direction on this. We need to, no one individual, no one organization can have input into this, have the overview of all of these issues. And that's why I think it's important to seek time over for the breakout rooms to get your input, and we welcome that for our project. Thank you for listening. I'll hand over to Dan. He will organize the breakout rooms. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lee. Just to mention any questions from in the room? Yes.
You know, just a simple question. The results from the survey are super interesting. Are those published any place, or can you share them?
We will be sharing the results from the survey with the Delphi group tomorrow as an opportunity to delve into those in a bit more detail, and also an opportunity to look at some of those resources, the ones that Lee was saying teachers had a less than favorable view of, and an opportunity to look at our observation questions for the next phase of our empirical research as well.
Perhaps worth saying that as a pilot, there are opportunities in the light of these conversations to refine further some of those questions, particularly that divide between the immediate and the pressing and the long-term structure. David,
yeah.
When was the survey done?
The survey was just a pilot, a brief pilot in February and March of this. It was launched in February, March of this year. So perhaps slightly before the AI moral panic in a way. I think one of the real motivators of this project is to try and move away from a model of digital citizenship or digital safeguarding that is driven by these moral panics. You know, that there seemed to be the issue of the algorithm 2 years ago, AI at the moment. About 3 or 4 years ago, there were lots of moral panics about inappropriate content on YouTube Kids, and all of these things that sort of just kind of come out of the ether, somehow lead to a kind of media moral panic, and there's a sense that schools have to do something, so they do something, but we don't really think about what that something might be. And so we're trying to really take a step back from that and think about what are the normative questions, what are the values that ought to guide our approach to some of these things. So it might just be a good opportunity just to get to know a bit about you. If I could start out just by asking if we could just go around and say who you are and what your current sort of practices are around digital citizenship or digital education. That would be a good kind of starting point. We can move on to thinking about how do we move from what we know at the moment towards the sorts of questions that you might have for the future. So if I could ask Janet is first on my screen.
Hi, I'm a researcher actually from Swansea University, and I'm helping one of our PIs doing a project on digital citizenship anyway. So we are researching also probably very similar areas to what you're doing. So we would like just to find out, you know, what's going on in Scotland.
I'm sorry, I'm getting no sound.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh, good. Okay. So we basically wanted to know what was happening in digital citizenship. We weren't quite aware that it was actually all to do with one particular project, but I mean, we were looking for more of a general approach. But yes, so we are looking at obviously we're concerned about how cyberbullying and basically governance of how this is going to take place in years to come. That's obviously one of our issues. Another issue, of course, is, you know, how do you create a digital citizen? Looking again at your thoughts of poverty, and whether everybody has equal access to methods of being able to get online in time or online, having the right equipment. So that's what we're looking for.
Thanks very much, Janet. I think we have Utkun.
Hello, I'm a lecturer in mathematics education at University of Glasgow. Actually, my research interest is not digital citizenship. I just wanted to join that webinar because I'm interested in, I think it's an important issue in the current era, and I just wanted to learn whether if I can integrate this digital citizenship to develop mathematical tasks to make students more aware of that issue. I think it's really important. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. You're welcome to come along and join us in person. I think one of our, I don't want to give away the identities of our in-person attendees, but I think you'd be very welcome. So who else do we have? Christina?
Yes, hello. I'm Christina Löving. I'm from University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and I'm conducting research on how teachers in Sweden, how they enact digital competence in their classrooms, and also digital citizenship. And I asked them about informal and formal learning and how they perceive it and how they enact it in the classroom. And I'm also conducting ethnographic research in a school right now. And I just published an article on this, and therefore I think it's really, really important and really interesting to see your project now, and so I will follow it very closely. So thank you.
Great. I'll keep an eye out for yours as well. It sounds like there are a lot of synergies there.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
I also have Haimin Dai.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, good afternoon. Because I'm in China, so right now it's good afternoon and probably good morning for everyone. I'm an assistant professor at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and my PhD research is mainly focused on online and blended learning. And I'm coming to join this meeting because I'm very interested in the digital citizenship, and because right now I'm switching my research focus into the smart learning environment, And I'm trying to see how the teachers and students interacting with smart learning techniques or apps, applications in the classroom. And I'm trying to see what kind of concept and idea I can learn from this presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I have two other people on my screen, Genevieve and Naomi.
Oh, hi. Yeah,
Hi.
I'm a lecturer at Roehampton in digital media and trainee computer science teachers, but I'm also just about to submit my PhD from Cambridge, which is raising awareness of data ethics for PGC computing using biometrics and classical ballet. So for me, this is a very big topic. And it's been quite interesting looking at what the teachers perceive as what is data ethics within their curriculum environment and what they can do based on the restrictions of the exam board specifications. So which is why I PhD and biometric data. So.
I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about that and what teachers perceive in your research, and the kinds of responses we were getting in the pilot survey. Are they similar to what you found, or are there differences or things that we're missing at the moment?
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to try and do was to humanize the data sets. So the data sets, everyone was over 18 as well. That was the other huge issue. Even though we teach secondary, I felt it was important that the people sharing their data had a legal and consent to actually share their biometric data, even though it was anonymized and all of the rest of it. So we added human stories to every time we shared a spreadsheet, which was of people's brainwave data or of their, we built a post-pose estimation tool. So we used to motion capture about how to create a human 3D model. And that allowed that kind of disconnect between the sort of spreadsheet version of the human to the real, the kind of data self is what we came up with, the sort of human and the data self. There was not too much of a separation, but at the same time, this allowed the teachers to think about every time they were interrogating and manipulate and either doing data sonification of these brainwave data or doing 3D modeling with the skeleton tracking, that there was a human behind it. And then also in terms of data governance, what are the processes that we look at beyond GDPR? So we took a zero trust methodology, we went through that. And then also in terms of how I analyze my data, which was both computational and I used IPA, so interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is quite text heavy, qualitative stuff. But I showed the teachers all the Python code that I used to do semantic analysis, because actually I thought it was really important that the participants were actually a bit like you were saying, the co-design, but actually they understood the methods behind what I was doing and how the challenges of actually when you're working and manipulating human data, where are the ethical implications from not just you using it, but to storing it and to where it goes. And then in terms of proprietary tools, who owns that human data? And especially with students in the classroom, one of the things that they were talking about, which I'm sure you've come across all of you, is the amount of data we collect just from logging them in, how well they behaved, whether they got any points in class, whether they got demerits in class. You know, you're talking thousands and thousands of data points over each term or semester. So it's been quite interesting in terms of how they were able to understand the sort of data governance and the challenges based on sort of a lot of studies also in China where they were actually using these headsets in classrooms, where we didn't have many studies in the UK that were doing that. But yeah, that's me. And hopefully my supervisors will let me submit next week.
Oh, wow. You're really close to finishing.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to hopefully you'll see that in publication as well. So lots of really interesting research that's going on in this area as well. So I'm just trying to think where we go from here. And I think one of the things I'd really like to find out a bit more about is what are the barriers to getting to the kinds of digital citizenship education that you would like to be doing, or you would like teachers to be doing, and how can we help to overcome those barriers? Just feel free to. Christina.
Yeah, thank you. See how I can lower my hand. So, yeah. Well, I think one issue is that it's important to discuss if we are talking about the future or if we're talking about here and now. Because when you talk to teachers about this, and I also think that policy documents sometimes target what's happening in the future and work life and what you need as a citizen, being a responsible citizen, having work. But today, when the digital is so incorporated into your life and students are participating in society here and now, maybe we have to talk more about what we mean with it. I mean, is it to be a citizen here and now as a 10-year-old, or is it also about the future? And yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important issue. Are we dealing with? I mean, one of the big challenges, I suppose, is the regulatory one, where within, if you like, analog citizenship education, you know that there are certain things that young people have a childhood to protect them from, that they don't have to go out and engage in the workplace, they don't have to go out and vote yet, they don't have to control their own finances and things. But when it comes to the digital, most of them have already built a sizable digital footprint before they even get into secondary schools. I mean, one of the things that people have said to us as we have begun to engage with teachers about this is, why did you do this at secondary? Why are you focusing on secondary? By the time kids get to us at age 11, 12, they've already been, and I'm discovering this at the moment, having a young child who's just got a mobile phone, at the age of 9. And like, I didn't have a mobile phone till I was 18, and it was a brick, and this is kind of just a different, anyway. But yeah, a couple of points in the chat as well about exams and exam boards. So, yeah, Genevieve and Janet mentioned this issue as well. What's the challenge with exams and exam boards? I mean, are there some simple wins, to put it more simply, are there some simple wins that we could have by simply having data ethics as one of the core elements of the curriculum for computer science, or for the philosophy and ethics paper in RE, for example? Or is there something else that we need to be thinking about at the moment? Naomi, sorry, I'm aware that I think you dropped off the call for a moment. Do you want to introduce yourself? Or are you happy just listening?
Sorry, my connection's not great. I work for an education charity, Young Citizens. We work across the UK. Interesting what you just said about younger students, because we work right from sort of 5-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and a lot of what we do is about trying to get some of these conversations happening with younger students for exactly the reason you just said. So the reason one of our trustees actually recommended me coming along today. They'd heard about your research, so just really interested to get any intel on what teachers are saying they want support with. We design a range of kind of active programs that go into schools across the UK to support with digital citizenship, generally working with citizenship teachers, but I say generally, it is quite a mixed bag. And we also design resources that teachers can use, more around, less on the kind of skills of online and more some of those bigger symptomatic questions, and helping young people understand the systems that they're inheriting and how to navigate them. Yeah.
Thanks, Naomi. I think that's a fascinating area. I might need to get in touch with you about another student of mine who's planning to do some research around citizenship, not specifically digital, but citizenship education, and is interested in talking to young citizens. If it's okay for me to.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Yeah.
Please
yeah.
Do.
But yeah, this issue of the systems that young people are inheriting, I think, is an interesting one. You know, that we still tend to think about this as being quite a new and emerging field, but in fact, we're talking about young people who've never not known having smartphones. They've never not known having, you know, social media, and one of the challenges that we're engaging with, going back to something that Janet said about the digital divide and digital access, and we're going to have a presentation after the break from Jeremy Knox about this idea of data justice, and people have started talking about this idea of a new digital divide, that whereas we are used to talking about the access divide, you know, that some people have access to the systems and some people don't. Part of the problem that we have now is that there are young people who are at a disadvantage precisely because they do have access to systems, precisely because they are giving a data footprint that is making them vulnerable to cyberbullying or radicalization, or being drawn into criminal activity by the things that they're being exposed to unreflectively online. That you've got some young people who do really have opportunities to connect and to learn because of the online space, whereas some of them really are being disadvantaged because of the data that they're giving to these systems, because they have access to it, because they've, you know, learned to see these systems as just, you know, sources of distraction. And yeah, but yeah, I think it's a really important challenge to think about. How do we prepare young people to be aware of the systems that they've inherited? You know, that's
yeah, and lots of the work we do is about, we framed in rights and responsibilities. So we'll take a really similar approach when we're talking about that digitally, as in, I'm going to say in inverted commas, because we have a lot of debate about the real world internally in our organisation, because the digital world is the real world as well. But yeah, helping them to, I say, to understand the systems they inherit, but also how those systems develop. You know, much like we will run programs with them so they understand how laws are made and how the political system that they are going to grow up in works, but also help. I think a lot of it is about upskilling them and giving them the necessary development in school, and I say that from the very youngest age up, to ask those critical questions of those systems as well, and do those systems work for them, and if they don't work for them, where is the power to see change, and where and is education giving them the skills the motivation as well, and the confidence to enact that change. And some interesting scenarios that were mentioned right at the beginning. I think you mentioned right at the beginning the police and the bias in the police system. We use that as an example in one of our digital citizenship programs, and really what we're asking young people to do is critique that. Like, if that was to happen, if that was to be put in place as a system, what might the implications be for you individually, for society, and who decides that that can take place? Do you understand how those decisions are made? And if in the future you wanted to take part in that, how would you go about that? So we take quite a similar approach when we're developing our digital stuff, and it is very much kind of framed in rights and responsibilities. And as you just said, David, I'm kind of understanding the systems that you're part of.
Right. I'm interested in the international perspective. Are these similar sorts of issues to the things that you're engaging with in Sweden or in China? Do these seem familiar, or are there perhaps solutions or different framings in your context?
Mm-hmm. I remember just one of our audience mentioned about exam that remind me some interview I have done with the teachers in K-12 schools in China, and I think one of the very important concern is that because of the examination in China might actually decide which school you can go to and which university can go to. So the exam will be placed as the most important part in Chinese education. So even though many K-12 schools in China has already invested a lot of money into the infrastructures of the technologies, but actually the teachers will be just using those techniques or technology just for sometimes for teaching evaluation, but not for real education interaction. When the evaluation period just go away and then they just switch to the original traditional methods. And this is the current situation. I'm not thinking in this way the student will learn how to be a digital citizen in the future, because at the moment they were just learning using the technology for entertainment rather than for education. This is the current situation here. And also I'm thinking about I have observed some of the adults in online, and they might using the internet or online learning material or different kinds of application to connect with other people's or community. But the result turned out to be that they're only connecting to people of the same kind. So I'm thinking whether this is the way we need to adjust for the digital citizenship. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can add a bit from Sweden then. And here's a lot of talk about exams, and the national tests are going to be digital next year, everything. And it's, yeah. And it's also much talk about AI and exams. And it's also from the Ministry of Schools. Now it's been a sort of thinking that the digital has to be reduced from schools because we are lowering our results in PISA, and we have to go back to the basics now. So that's a big issue here in Sweden, but not all schools. There are a big debate about it, and so on. But I think that one thing, we have a lot of, the schools are digitalized, and the students from lower secondary schools and up onwards, they have their own laptop provided by school. So they have digital, it's really digitalized. But it's a lot of talk about not using them because it's not good for people to use it. And it's also used for handing in assignments and these kind of things, but not to practice. And also, GDPR is there to let people be safe and to protect data. But that makes teachers afraid of, can I use this? And sometimes I use it, but I don't say it to anyone. and there are no really collaboration between students and other schools, because it's always inside their own school and the platforms. A lot of platformizations going on. So that's something happening here in Sweden now, which, yeah.
I think this issue of platforms is interesting. I mean, we have, in Scotland, we have a single platform called Glow, which is the platform for digital learning in primary and secondary schools. And that seems to be, it has similar issues, but perhaps slightly less problematic for sharing, although again, because of GDPR, in practice, it tends not to involve a lot of sharing. One of the groups of schools we're hoping to work with on this project is in a local authority area where the local authority for the entire city has done a deal with Apple to provide iPads for all of the pupils. With the location tracking settings stuck in the on position, which we're not quite sure who gets access to that, but that's interesting. But I think a lot of this sort of platformization and the infrastructure, as a teacher, all you really have time to think about is, does the infrastructure work? You know, can I get my students online, and you know, can they engage with these learning materials in class or as homework at the time that I want them to? And so there isn't the time, I think, for a lot of teachers to think about what are the platforms and the power relations and the data footprints and the data protection implications of all of these different systems. But you know, it would be interesting to look internationally to do a comparison of what some of those platform arrangements are. I know in Germany, Sigrid Hartung did a project fairly recently for the German research councils, looking at how different federal states within Germany handled their sort of data platforms. So whether we're being told 5 minutes left in the breakout rooms, there's so much I'd love to know from all of you, but are there any other kind of issues that you'd like to raise before we go for a break? Any questions for us? Is there anything you'd like us to be? Oh, teacher training. Janet was raising this issue. Teacher training. Anything in particular on teacher training?
Well, I'm just thinking, I know the age I am. And suddenly this digital wave has hit. Not that we didn't see it coming, because we were probably the forerunners of it. But it's how do you get teachers in the classroom now to partly be aware of this, of, you know, perhaps for a certain generation of teachers, to bring them on board, to bring them up to skills wise, to be aware of, as you said, if you're in the classroom, you're teaching a particular subject, you tend to get sucked into that particular subject. It's very hard to see the wider implications of what that might mean for future generations or for school. And when you're talking platforms, I mean, are you seriously going to have your platform so that your local neighbour school, which might also be your rival, can have access to what's happening to your students? So I think there's a whole area of teacher awareness, teacher thinking, maybe even senior management thinking as well within your schools, as to where this is all going to go. And we've talked about meta universes and metadata. What is the ultimate? I think maybe it's the ultimate fear, perhaps, of what's going to happen to all this stuff. And are we creating digital citizens, or are we creating digital citizens for what the school wants rather than what perhaps the world needs? Does that make sense?
I mean, what sort of sense do teachers have of when they should be using technology? I mean, Christina raised this issue of the sort of back to basics thing. I think England in particular went down a very hard traditionalist sort of route in COVID recovery in 2020-21, there was this sense that there should be no mobile phones, students should be sitting in class facing the front and listening to the teacher, you know, go back to pen and paper exams at the first possible opportunity. What sort of sense do teachers have of when they should be using technology or excluding the technology? Or yeah, I think those are.
I would say our experience of delivering in England is it's a hugely mixed bag. You will have, I mean, we partly as a response to COVID put lots of our active programs that would go into schools online, and we now do kind of a hybrid version of both. And we still have issues. You know, we run a mock trial competition all over the country. You know, you go to one school and they can get you a laptop suite. They've got cameras that will follow their kids around the room, and it's all great. And, you know, you go to the next and they're not even allowed to sit with their camera on. You know, no matter what safeguarding we've put in place, the schools just said no. So it's hugely different, I would say. And even in terms of the platforms, I know, David, you mentioned a platform that Scotland uses, but I mean, the platforms we use, you talk to one school versus another school in the same town almost, and they'll be like, no, we're using this. The school says we're using this. And there doesn't necessarily always seem to be rhyme or reason as to why that decision was made. That was just the decision that was made by senior management. And I don't think teachers, certainly a lot of the teachers we talk to, necessarily understand that process, why it was made, and their hands are a bit tied.
I'd be interested to know whether the senior managers understand the decisions that are made. But anyway, thank you so much for this conversation, and please do feel free to get in touch. This has been great. I think we're going for a 10-minute break, and we'll be back in the main room at 11.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I don't know whether to be excited by it or scared by it. And I'm a little bit of both. I mean, as a background with a background in philosophy and theology, I think what these technologies will do over time to our sense of what it is to be human is really interesting. I think it's a really interesting question. You know, at the moment, of course, we always associate sentient forms of life with carbon. But if we end up with what we might call silicate forms of life, what does that say about who we are and what we are? And then, you know, my son-in-law is heavily involved in quantum engineering. And he works for a big engineering firm that does a lot of security work. And, you know, having a conversation with him the other day about what he's doing in the quantum world, it's just mind-boggling. You know, I often think, I used to think that this challenge was a challenge between that mirrored the introduction of print and incunabula in the 15th century, and it leads to 100 years of European religious wars. I actually now think it's much more like Prometheus bringing fire and ending up being pecked by crows for the rest of eternity. So there is something extraordinary about all of this, and that's one of the things that drives me. Anybody else like to just throw in what some of these drivers are for them?
I think for me, it just opens up the world a little bit as well. Like certainly the subjects that I'm involved in, it allows ease of contact, which I'm quite passionate about. So it really allows for exploring of different narratives, of connecting with different people, and so for me, that's the exciting part of the development of technology, I think.
And so do you basically see it, Heather, as an opening up of communication and ways of looking at the world?
I think so, yeah. I think that's primarily, if I was to speak to any of my trainees or any of the RE teachers, I suppose that's primarily how it's kind of used, really. Being able to do a virtual tour of a mosque, saying kind of Saudi Arabia, you know, comparing it to a mosque in, say, Liverpool, you know, there's lots of opportunities. You know, suddenly the world's on our doorstep, whereas we couldn't have done these things kind of, you know, some time ago. So yeah, that for me is the most exciting part of it, really.
Yeah, I mean, you see, at one level, yeah, it's almost like an enhancement of
Yeah.
our existing pedagogic practices.
Yep.
But at another level, it's something radically different.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
it's going to
absolutely.
reimagine the world for us.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's the bit that both fascinates me and actually I find incredibly scary.
Yeah.
But even the enhancement is not, I think there is the element of enhancement, and for many years we thought that it was just enhancement, isn't it? And
yeah,
you know, even the name of the field is kind of like, is problematic because there is a really big kind of like strand in the field of digital education, which is about technology enhanced learning, you know, which is very problematic because it's a kind of like building on assumptions that technology just enhances learning, you know, out of like default enhances learning.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily proven yet. I think, you know, I think it brings an alternative way of doing things, definitely. But I think we're becoming increasingly more aware of the inequalities, as David was saying, you know, and of the harms and of exclusions that actually technology brings into this.
Yeah.
I think that's right, Colin. One of the things I mean, I initiated this project. I didn't want to lead it because I'm an old man now. But I initiated it because Bob and I, who's on the other chat forum, had been doing some work on stupidity. And I put into ChatGPT the other day a request to write an essay on stupidity. It was bloody awful. Because it misunderstood stupidity. Why? Because lots of people who put input into the digital spaces misunderstand stupidity. They think stupidity is some kind of antonym for knowledge. And it's got nothing to do with knowledge. You know, stupidity is widely distributed across all educational and social classes and knows no boundaries of discrimination between the highly educated and the lowly educated. There are plenty of virtuous peasants and thick as mince university administrators. So, you know, that was what one of my drivers was, realizing that people don't understand what is being done to them.
But I think you were able to kind of like critically engage with what ChatGPT was giving you because you had that kind of like expertise, isn't it?
Exactly. I've spent the last 2 or 3 years thinking about it, and that's the problem. You know, if somebody else looked at that essay and say, "Oh yeah, that looks like an interesting essay," and it's utterly formulaic. I put in 2 other essays. One was, what is Jim Conroy's contribution to moral education, and what is Jim Conroy's contribution to religious education? Oh, I mean, apparently I'm a world-leading expert in both. And it was, and both of them could have been carbon copies of each other. They'd actually just taken all these words and arranged them, and they assigned to me a 4-schema understanding of moral education that I've never written. So what they've done is they extracted lots of bits and pieces, reshaped them, and they have this kind of historic approach. So the Greeks thought this. The Romans thought this in the medieval period.
About morals,
you know, and somehow you look at these things and you think, but this is just misinformation. I don't care what it looks like superficially, and that's been kind of part of my driver. But you know, I'm an old man now. I'm 68. I'm interested in what you think. Well, one of the ways we phrased it is, what do you hope for young people as digital citizens?
Yeah, I feel we are drawn in technology. So I hope one day we stop using technology for just a minute to focus in our real life. So especially
Hiba, what do you mean? What do you mean focus on our real?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Sorry, could you repeat your question? Because
what do you mean by focus on real life? Maybe could you say a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, because I have done or I have published an article about using ethnography methodology. So I found the students in like year 1 and 2 during the pandemic, they cannot distinguish between the real life and the digital life.
Okay.
And especially after the pandemic, now children, especially children, they cannot focus in offline life. So if you take their phones or digital device from them, they feel like they lost something important. They cannot live without their devices. So they are distracted by their devices. So I'd like to teach children, especially children, without any technology, just with pen and paper. Yeah.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I'd be interested in all of your views on this. I've been struggling with this thing about real life and virtual life. You know, I think the boundary is much more porous than people think. And I mean, when I'm reading a book, am I in real life? And you know, and my imagination may be flying into all kinds of areas that I've never actually experienced. You know, if I'm reading a novel, there's a real fashion for novels resuscitating stories of Greek gods at the moment. And I read them avidly, and I'm entering into the life of Ariadne or whoever it happens to be.
Are you reading this on an iPad, or is it like a real book?
No, it's an actual book. I'm a book man. I like books. I like lying in bed reading a book. I don't like lying in bed reading my iPad. So, but you know, does it change the fundamental experience if I read it on my iPad or I read it in a book? Are both of them real? You know, I'm still embodied. I've still got an object in front of me. I'm still engaging with that object. So to what extent, when we talk about people, young people in the real world and young people in virtual worlds, to what extent is the virtual world just part of the real world now?
Can I come in here?
Please.
Because I was kind of like thinking, I had this question in my head when David was introducing today's session, and I was thinking, do we really need because also in the results of the pilot study, of the pilot survey that Lee was presenting, there was this idea of, you know, this is kind of like really important terms, that somebody was responding that this is an important term, but the education is full of these kind of like really weighted terms, and it doesn't really make any sense, and it leaves me cold. I think this is what the person said. I'm kind of like thinking, do we really need the term digital citizenship, or should we just be talking about citizenship here? You know, because the way that I see it, I think our everyday life is both digital and real, if I kind of like use what you were just saying before, you know, and this is everyday life. This is real life, you know, it's not, I don't think there is any kind of like hard division between the two. And I'm kind of like thinking that it's quite redundant right now to be talking about the virtual and the real. I think they're all kind of like intertwined.
Yeah. Interesting. Heather, did you want to come in there?
Well, no, I think that it's quite true, isn't it, really? I wonder if our definitions of what kind of reality are shifting, and, you know, as you say, just because something exists in a digital realm doesn't not make it real, if that makes sense. So I kind of agree with that, really. Yeah.
And I'm
sorry, Kula. Sorry, am I pronouncing your name properly? Kula?
It's Kula.
Kula.
Yes.
Sorry, I beg your
Yeah,
pardon.
yeah. That's fine. Don't worry. It's an odd spelling, just translated from Greek to English.
And I'm Irish, so I wouldn't even understand that.
I'm kind of like wondering whether young people actually see the division, you know, drawing on what Hiba was saying. I think that they are kind of like moving and transitioning across both worlds quite a natural way, quite a natural, you know, because it's a form of socializing. It's a form of entertaining. It's a form of spending their leisure time, I think, on their devices, the same way that we do. You know, I don't think there is anything that is purely about young people or kind of like us, older people. You know, I think we are kind of like sharing some similarities in the way that we're using devices. Maybe it's happening in a maybe more acute way among young people.
But adults, adults have self-discipline, children not. So maybe this is a problem.
Hiba, you know more adults with self-discipline than I do. I know lots of adults who have no self-discipline. Indeed, I've worked with quite a few of them.
Yeah, I like technology because now I can meet you. You are in UK and I'm in Saudi Arabia, so I like technology, but not all the time.
I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. And when we ask, well, what are your hopes for young people in this space? Well, if you think the space is just the same as the spaces that human beings have always inhabited, there is a danger in missing something as well. That our material culture is changing around us. And yet my hopes, I mean, if I was to put my hopes in a couple of sentences, it is that young people will still be able to draw on what we might call historic analog practices of good judgment, discrimination, discernment, sorting out the wheat from the chaff, knowing what is absolute horseshit, and be able to identify it and know why it's horseshit. But I would have said, as an educator and as a former, I too once taught in schools many years ago, you know, I would have said, I've always tried to do that. That's been my life's work, is to teach people to make judgments. And, you know, the digital world doesn't change that. So we may inhabit these kind of hybrid spaces, but surely the kind of capacities and skills one needs to navigate them remain distinctly analog. Or am I wrong?
In a sense, you are able to make judgments when you have the right information in front of you, isn't it? Or you have the skills to be able to make informed judgments. I think that the main difference here, and I don't know, this is how I feel, for example, is that there are lots of unknowns in how digital is kind of like operating or how digital is influencing our life. For example, I'm not entirely sure how ChatGPT gives the responses, you know. Where is how they make the text mining, for example, to be able to do this, to offer these responses, you know, how these experiments and tests are done. So I'm kind of like think that we're missing that, and maybe and I think this gap is becoming maybe a bit more kind of like big in how technologies are developed or how technologies are
Are you suggesting, Kula, just so I'm clear, are you suggesting that we need to spend more time educating young people about what's inside the black box, so to speak?
I'm kind of like thinking that I don't have an answer to this, Jim, but maybe that's something that we need to be spending a bit more time, isn't it? I mean, I even kind of like thinking, I mean, I'm in the field and maybe I didn't spend much time here on this kind of like particular, I'm not entirely sure what kind of like where the analytics that universities are collecting about our students are coming from, So, these are kind of like things that, data is gathered in an automatic way, or predictions are done in an automatic way, but there are people developing these things behind them, isn't it? And I think that there is no transparency as such on how some of these maybe decisions at the technological level, how some of these things are happening. For me, there are lots of gaps in my knowledge and there are lots of unknowns. And that is, I think, probably what is fueling fear about technology.
Yeah.
At least this is how I'm kind of like feeling right now,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you saw in those teacher responses from the pilot that Lee was looking at, you saw some of the insecurities there. That of course teachers will focus on things like cyberbullying and the present and immediate dangers.
They were very situated, isn't it? Because this is the things that they are kind of like facing in their everyday lives.
Exactly.
In their everyday school lives and professional lives, yeah.
And yet, in being so fixated on those things, we are in danger of missing some of these other challenges around big data, around how big data is used. I mean, of course, big data can be used for good purposes. I was vice principal here and the dean of the faculty, and so I use data a lot in my job to allocate resources, to look at markets, to develop those. And at the same time, I'm acutely aware of the dangers that someone having so much data on another citizen means for that citizen's control of their life. And I do find myself caught between the hope of the digital and the fear of 1984.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think what we are hearing is lots about the dangers. In a sense, we are not really hearing many of the positive narratives. And again, that's kind of like an issue here. But yes, I think that, and because you asked the question, what do we hope about young people? I'm kind of like hoping that they will be able to deliberate and being part of how some of these decisions are made, because I think at the moment we're kind of like seeing lots of narratives that are very much driven by industry, because they're controlling, there are specific industries and specific, I don't know, people, individuals that they really have lots of power in their hands because they can develop the technical parts of, the infrastructure. And we are not part of that because we don't have that domain expertise, isn't it?
I think you're absolutely right. And this is a big problem in education. That's why we have so many people involved here who are experts in that domain deliberately. And we'll hear from Zhao later on, who is a computer scientist, and how he's doing work in participatory engagements. So I do think that you're absolutely right to say, well, look, we have to, the technology is not going to go away any more than fire went away when Prometheus gave it to humans, or print went away in the 15th century. I mean, print causes 100 years of war, as I said. And the technology is going, and you can see the US and China squaring up to each other over. I mean, this is a battle to control global technology. There's no doubt about that. So we need, then it's not going away. So you rightly say we're not doing enough to positively engage with this. And if you looked at that list, it's all about the fears that teachers have, not about, and Hiba's observation around retaining these old analog practices, I have huge amount of sympathy for.
Me too.
But we have to find a way of doing that and presenting it to young people in a way that recognizes this very different digital space and not see the digital space as something outside their experience and their human experience is somehow the world in which they happen to be sitting. I mean, at the moment, we are having this conversation digital, but it's a real conversation in the world.
Yeah. So I have a question. So do you think technology decreased some skills?
Technology bequeath what?
Decrease, lower, or like steal some skills from us.
Steal something from us.
Decrease skills. Yeah.
Sorry,
steal some skills like remembering.
Steal skills from us. Yeah, absolutely. I think there is that danger, but isn't the challenge as educators to make sure that we educate people to develop their skills?
Because I'm worried that technology make people stupid.
Honestly, I can promise you, I'm 68 years of age, and I promise you this: people were stupid long before technology.
Yeah, when I see to the when I like observe the children, so I don't know, their mind just connected to the devices, to the technology. They lose some important skills. They don't use their mind.
But isn't it? But then the task for us as educators is surely to look at how those what you call those skills of the mind, those what I call analog capacities, how they engage in the digital spaces. So we're going to have to find new ways of thinking about having the conversation. So, but some of them will be very old. If we take, David's concern about exams that he opens up with. Well, I was a visiting professor at the University of Warsaw about 12 or 13 years ago, and ironically funded by the European Union. And all my exams were oral exams. So I gave the students 3 papers, 24 hours before the exam, and then interrogated them on the 3 papers, then recorded it. So I was using the digital and assessed it at the same time. And so I was able to justify the assessment because I had the recording. And you can tell more from engaging with student in a conversation than sometimes you can from continuous assessment assignment, because you've forced them into thinking about these things. So
that's a big discussion, isn't it?
It's a really big discussion.
The assessment, yes. It goes down to what is the purpose of the assessment as well. And
exactly.
Yeah. So
where would you see the future if you see, oh, we're gonna lose you now, sorry. Look, I'm sorry, I hope we can continue the conversation.
And I started my lectureship after Welcome Week and 2 days before teaching started. So I feel a little bit like I'm a tiny bit on the back foot with the stuff that I would have otherwise be doing outside of teaching. But yeah, that's kind of what where I am in my career. But I was just telling Sally that I'm leading a small project at Swansea on digital citizenship. And so we got the call for the internal funding in December last year. My project was, accepted in January, and we've kind of been, we're doing that and collecting data for a small sort of pilot study this week on Thursday. Very much interested in digital citizenship. At the moment, from a Welsh perspective, we've got the new curriculum for Wales, although it's still relatively new. It's kind of unfolding at the moment, and my expertise, my background is youth citizenship. So I did my PhD on young people's citizenship, and really really kind of conceptualizing that from a youth perspective, kind of drawing on Ruth Lister and Kath Larkins and things like that. Yeah, and very much interested in you know, in young people's agency, and I think there's a lot of work around teachers' agency, especially in Wales, you know, because the shift in the curriculum and things like that.
Several of our colleagues involved in that.
Right, yeah. So I'm very
Long,
interested in the kind of the youth perspective. Obviously, that sits within a wider network of, you know, teachers, school and institutions and things like that. But you know, there's a lot of barriers.
So could you listen? Keep talking. I need to go and deal with a late arrival. Okay.
No,
no worries. You keep talking.
Yeah, yeah. So I was thinking from, like, you know, the questions that Bob was posing and the list of priorities, and you know, and they kind of said, you know, pick your most important from this list, and I thought that feels really difficult. Because it just feels very difficult to pick one priority, and it's a very complex and nuanced area, isn't it? And I wonder whether picking one priority is kind of like redundant, because they all kind of fit within one another in some way. And I really want to kind of pass on some details to David and his colleague about resource creation. I'm in contact with someone from, I don't know whether you know of them, Common Sense Education. They have they've got a whole curriculum on digital citizenship, and I had a meeting with her last week, and she's very, very interested in being involved in research and, you know, trying to create those connections, but also get feedback on their own curriculum and how schools are using it. So yeah, I mean, I could definitely put people in contact with her. She's based in England, but actually Common Sense have worked with the Welsh government in developing resources on the hub, which is where all of our kind of documents are for teachers. There.
Colleagues, can I introduce you to another addition to our breakout room?
Yes.
With whom I'm peculiarly well acquainted because he's my son.
Okay.
This is Christopher, my son, who's a primary teacher currently seconded on these issues to his local authority. But please continue.
Yeah,
we just can't quite see Chris. Can you, Christopher? Can you? That's better. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. That's lovely.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Sally, and this is Zoe. Zoe's just explaining what she's doing at Swansea.
Yeah,
fascinating.
I was listening to that actually. Yeah, it sounds. You were talking about the a digital citizenship program that they have, Zoe. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was saying that I had a meeting last week with someone from Common Sense Education, who David might be interested in connecting with if they're interested in speaking to people who are developing resources, creating resources for schools, because that is their job, specifically for digital citizenship. And so they might be, I know that they're really, really interested in engaging in more research. And, you know, she was saying very much to kind of develop, get feedback on and develop their curriculum as well. But I was talking about how, you know, I was thinking about this list of priorities and how difficult it is to choose one priority, and the more I'm kind of learning about this, the more reluctant I am to kind of pick sort of one priority. And when I was speaking to Common Sense last week, from where I'm sitting and my own sort of research interests, I tend to look at, I'm very interested in that kind of, you know, around 16-year-old gaining independence, voting age being lowered to 16 and that kind of thing. And so the work that I've done up until this point has been primarily secondary school and kind of teenage years. And she's sort of, so the priorities for that age group are very different to other age groups, and you can kind of break that down even more. But she was saying how, and I guess as a lecturer, when I think about digital technology and education and what we're doing with our students, you know, we're thinking about different types of assessment, different, you know, employability, that kind of thing. I'm not really as exposed to some of the what might be prioritized for younger ages, which she raised from her perspective in her work, in terms of online safety and you know, increasing mental health issues. And she kind of gave this example of, you know, if a very, very young child struggling and they have access to something like Chat GPT, and that's their line of communication, and you're talking to a computer. And so I think it's difficult to choose a priority, just a kind of overarching priority, because there's so many different contexts that we kind of explore this. But yeah, sorry, I've talked a lot, so
No,
someone else can chip in.
Really interesting. Sally?
Yeah, so I head up the Religion, Values and Education Special Interest Group at BERA. So this was a kind of joint thing, and I was saying to Zoe that I sort of have worked with David in terms of him presenting at BERA in the past. So I haven't got an awful lot of experience of working in this particular area, but I've got my own views on it. So my area is mainly race and ethnicity. So I'm particularly interested in the surveillance bit, actually, in terms of the prevent policy and how that can be detrimental to Muslim pupils in particular, in terms of, you know, them being coined as a suspect community, whether we agree with that or not. You know, I think a lot of Muslim students feel that. So I'm quite interested in the whole area that you know, both David and Lee were talking about, in terms of what makes a computer intelligent, and the whole idea of ethics from that perspective. So I'm very influenced by film. So I don't know whether anybody's seen the film Eagle Eye, with Shia LaBeouf in it. Yeah. And also I, Robot with Will Smith in it. You know, it's all that kind of thing, the extent to which, and you know, it's been very much in the news recently, actually. We were so excited that we'd got this planned for months, and then all of a sudden, the last couple of weeks, there's been quite a lot in the news about AI and all these tech people, you know, the people that make or design artificial intelligence are saying we need to put the brakes on. This could get very much out of control here. And one has this idea of, you know, the Matrix as well, those sorts of ideas of where, you know, there are lots of good things about computers, artificial intelligence, all this kind of thing that can really, really help in lots of different ways. But where I have concerns is where there is not a human with ethical ideas to keep tabs on what's happening. So that's where my concern comes in, and where, you know, for many people, an idea of the transcendent, or destiny, or justice, social justice in particular, or God, it takes control. It now might be the case that artificial intelligence can take control, because they you know, it can understand. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, can understand complexity that a human being, one human being, or even a collective of human beings just can't. So for me, I quite like the idea of working in harmony, you know, humans doing what we're good at, and artificial intelligence doing what it's good at, and working together. But I can see that there is great potential for want of another word, villains, to kind of harness this as you've got in as you've got in like 007 and various other Marvel things. Do you know that sort of thing? So that's where I'm interested, where my interest comes, but I haven't done any research in the area. It's just something that I'm interested in and that we talk about a little bit. So yeah, it can be, it's a bit like anything really. It can be a real force for good, but it could be a real force for inequity in particular. Absolutely. And this is the thing that I'm very interested in, what David was saying earlier about, you know, exams, ranking your students. I mean, I remember you know, during COVID, my own children were doing GCSEs and A-levels. One of them finished and gone on already, but you know, it seemed very arbitrary. It's like that's not fair, you know.
Marked down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christopher? Yeah, no, just a couple of things from what you've both been saying. So initially, to speak to Sally's, to Zoe's point, at the start you were talking about the priorities and how it's very difficult to pick one. So when I filled out the survey, I filled it out alone, and then I did it with some colleagues. Again, I sat with people and I said, what would you think for this? And a lot of them thought all of the priorities were a concern, but some were, and they immediately identified this immediate threats, and they thought something like surveillance is sure, and the use of children's data is a big serious problem, but it's not as serious a problem for them in their day-to-day practice as cyberbullying is and things like that. But as I was watching, and as Zoe was speaking there, as I was watching the presentations, I thought to myself, there's so many of these priorities that I think can be distilled like into one priority, if you know what I mean. So we have, for me, one of the big ones is radicalization, especially if you think of through sort of far right, sort of this radicalization by stealth thing that's going on with Andrew Tate and all these sort of characters. Combine that with the algorithmic thing, factors of YouTube and Instagram and all these sort of things, factor in the harmful content of self-harm and things like that we start to see. And I feel as if that's all part of the one issue. They all really come together because so often it's not children Googling, let's say, Andrew Tate or someone like that. It's an algorithm that's feeding them this information based on this kind of, it is a hate-fueled cycle of anger that is what it runs off of. So I thought that was really interesting. You were saying, Zoe, there about the priorities. And you also mentioned, I think, the thing about the digital citizenship kind of pathway program. In my authority where I work, we have a pathway and a program for digital literacy. We have a pathway and a program for computer science, but we don't have anything on digital ethics or digital citizenship. And I think that's, from the initial conversation I'm hearing today, it feels like it's an essential factor, something, an essential piece of the puzzle to create this sort of trio, this sort of trident of attacks, which I think would be really interesting to look at. With regard to Sally, what you're saying, I have a lot of feelings on the whole AI question. Now, I haven't done any research on it myself either, but I have seen it a bit in school. Now, I'm originally a primary school practitioner, and so the children aren't using AI in the same way a high school student is to write an essay or whatever else. But I'm seeing children kind of fool around with it and explore it, and like you said, talk to it like it's a person, which is a really interesting and kind of worrying, but also kind of exciting kind of sort of thing. But what I see when they're having conversations with it is it's capable of things like it hallucinates and stuff. It produces information that's conceivable as an answer, but if you know your stuff, it's completely incorrect. Yeah. And I was listening to, I don't know if anyone else heard this, and I'm sure there'll be some people here today who will have. It was the founder of Wikipedia. Not sure if anyone came across this. He was speaking about AI recently, and he said it's, you know, great possibilities for things like writing computer programs. It can really take out the heavy lifting for a programmer to write, again, some sort of algorithm or whatever else. And he said, but in simpler things, he said what he does is he quite often types in who is, and I can't remember the chap's name, John Smith, we'll say. He says, who's John Smith? No, it's his wife's name he types in, that's right. And we'll say his wife's name's Samantha or something. And he types in, who's Samantha something's husband? Now, she's a woman who's not famous, but she has been in the public eye because she's the wife of the founder of Wikipedia. So there's articles on her, there's photographs, things like this. And every time he's asked this question, ChatGPT or whichever OpenAI gets it completely wrong. It says someone who's conceivable, a quasi-famous person, someone in tech, but it's never ever him. And I'm interested about how it's given us this sort of false probabilities. You know, children are going to go on, and I give them an assignment on, you know, the Weimar Republic or something, and they type in and they get answers that look probable but are not accurate and things like that. So I think there's a huge number of kind of gaps. And the final thing the thing that concerns me most about the AI argument, especially when it comes to children and learning, is we talk about science fiction, Sally, and how in the films and when we were younger, it was always the AI would do the menial tasks. It would serve you your food. It would order your shopping from your smart fridge and all this sort of stuff. Well, human beings were free to become more enlightened and pursue creativity and the arts. And what we're seeing as AI is being born before our eyes is it's doing the creativity. It's Mid-Journey. It's creating art. It's writing Beatles songs. It's creating all these wonderful things. There's novels. Someone says, have you read the ChatGPT kind of novel that's floating around out there? And it's us that are being left with the menial service industry kind of Deliveroo kind of gig economy jobs, and the AI is. And I think that's a huge thing, I think, for children who we say to them, the promotion of something like expressive arts is something children are losing interest in. And now with the advent of AI, they're like, well, why would I learn to paint when I can just get an AI to paint for me? I've got a character I want to draw. I don't need to draw it. I just type in the prompts to Mid-Journey, and Mid-Journey creates it. The way Mid-Journey creates it is through theft, intellectual theft, you know, of intellectual property, interestingly. And a chap I know who is in tech, lives in Michigan, and I said to him what was his thought on it, and he said, well, I think this is great. He's younger than me. He's in his 20s. He said, this is great because I can, when it comes to the arts, I can write, I can play music, but I can't put a paintbrush on canvas. I find that impossible. Now I can. Now I can. It's leveled the playing field in terms of the arts. And I think that's fascinating. I think that has real implications.
Can I ask the three of you a question? In response to you, Sally, I come at these things through culture and literature and theology and the arts and so on. And I'm writing something just now about the 1956 film Forbidden Planet, which is an AI prophecy film based on Shakespeare's Tempest. But I want to ask you, in the light of the things the three of you have said, how many of these threats or opportunities are extensions of things that always existed in the analog world, as it were? And how many of them are uniquely digital, that they come with the digital revolution and present challenges and potential opportunities to us that have no analog precursor? So bullying, for example, has always happened. It's just that cyberbullying might be a kind of escalation.
I think it's difficult because there's a rate. What you're right, that cyberbullying has always existed, of course, and things like that. But cyberbullying to me does feel unique in the same way that the AI and the arts feels unique, because it's the rate of change at which the apps and the software goes through. That is really, the way bullying manifested itself in the playground always had a kind of baseline. You kind of knew the sort of things to look out for. You knew the behaviours of children. You knew the reactions of children. You could say, well, so-and-so's reverted into themselves a bit, so I can maybe suspect here that there's a relationship issue with someone. Whereas in the digital space, in the online sort of landscape, it's this new app, it's this new place to chat, it's Snapchat videos that are 3 seconds long and there's no evidence of anything. It feels that it is a natural extension. Yeah, a lot of these things are natural extensions, but they're evolving so fast as to become quite unrelated to what's going on. But that's my only sort of point.
Zoe?
Yeah, and also on that note, the parameters have changed, right? So what you're dealing with in school, actually, I also think conversations online that have happened after school on the weekend that kind of permeate. So with with digital technology and cyberbullying, or which also is very difficult to put a parameter around as well, because bullying can look like lots of different things or whatever. It makes it really difficult to to kind of just manage that within a school setting.
I think we're getting a warning that the
just 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Sally?
5 minutes.
Very, very quickly then. Yeah, I think the democratization of knowledge, it's possibly been heightened by AI. I think, so Google Planet, I mean, in the past, it was only the wealthy kids that had atlases, whereas in their houses, whereas now anybody can look at anything at any time in any way. And that's a good thing in terms of things like Google Planet, but I think it's a terrible thing in terms of pornography, and that wouldn't have been accessible to certain children in the past, and now it is.
Yeah, and the alarming rate at which, in my line of work, we're seeing children access this is, again, it's moving so rapidly. It's going faster and faster and faster, younger and younger and younger. The last piece of research I saw, I thought they said as young as primary 4, I think now. So that's 7, 8 years old, year 5. The rate at which this is sort of extrapolating and everything's kind of, it's wild. Yeah.
Are we kind of still agreed, the 4 of us, as it were, that schools and education is the key here? Do we still have that kind of faith?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's an interest from what you were saying. It makes me, when we were talking about like computers and AI and technology doing the arts, and and we're left doing the menial jobs, I think, and then also linking it to that point, the question that you were asking, like, is this an extension of the problems we already have, or is it completely separate? And I think there's a really interesting and also really sad and scary discussion around the economy and meritocracy and what we value, and how young children are when they start to decide, okay, well, what subjects am I going to be interested in that are going to help me choose my GCSEs and then my job and then my future, and what's going to help me earn like a basic living wage, and where is the funding? Is the funding in the arts, or we all know the answer to that. So I think it's a very sad discussion in a lot of ways. But also, I guess my point would be like, that seems to suggest to me it is an extension of some issues that we already have in many ways, and the broader issue of it. 100%.
Social exclusion.
Because who has the freedom and the privilege to explore the arts and not worry so much about, well, will it get me a job? Because that is really important to be able to get a job, and those are important justifiable decisions that children are having to make very early on, and in schools you're telling them.
One of the interesting phrases in the literature that we unearthed was digital feudalism. We're going to go back to a kind of super elite that enjoys all kinds of privileges through the AI revolution, and a digital peasantry that will simply serve them. And that there's tremendous dangers there, I think.
I think your final thing that we said about the as educators, the schools still have the power. I think we definitely do. I think we have to be optimistic and hopeful, but I also think we really need to get a move on, because it's moving so fast. The children are living in a digital landscape where we've got the maps to navigate it, the digital pathways and things like this, but we don't speak the language of the natives, So we really need to be navigating it with more intelligence, I think.
Colleagues, we're down to the last minute. Is there any last observation you'd like to put forward? We're recording this, but remember, voice recording it. So anything else you want to lay down? Well, can I thank you then and apologise for the slightly ragged start, but we, I think, made up for it in the quality of the contributions.
Yeah.
Thank you
yeah,
so much.
really interesting to meet you guys.
Yes, thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Really,
you.
really
Thank
good
you.
discussion.
See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
See you in a bit.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
We're still here for a sec. I guess we'll wait until we get kicked off.
We'll get called back. We'll suddenly go. Yes.
Yes, I imagine so. Yeah.
Like a rapture.
Welcome everyone back and to introduce Jeremy Knox from the Centre for Digital Education, is it? Centre for Research and Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh to talk to us about data justice.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So my name is Jeremy Knox. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh being a great friend and collaborator of Glasgow. If you've heard anything else, it's not true. And I co-direct the Centre for Research in Digital Education. So what I wanted to do in the next few minutes is talk to you about this term, data justice, and try to provide a kind of definition. It's a term that seems to be used a lot when we're talking around these issues of citizenship and the digital. And I think it's worth stripping some of that back and providing some clear definitions of what I think people mean. And I want to do that by sort of posing the question, how did we get to this point where a term like data justice has salience? And I want to try and just focus on both these terms by way of answering that question. So firstly, data. And I want to take us back to 2010, arguably where all of us had a very positive relationship with social media, the zenith of our positive feelings towards digital technology. Mark Zuckerberg was on the front of Time magazine as Person of the Year. He's described, you probably can't see in the small print, as the connector. Arguably, as a society, we had a view of social media purely in terms of its ability to connect us and to improve our social lives. And at the same time, the technology was imbued with a sense of politics, a sense of being liberatory. This is an image that was depicting a series of events around 2010, which principally took place across the north of Africa that came to be known as the Arab Spring. At the time, these social movements and these activist movements, although the position on that has changed considerably since then, but it's important to acknowledge at the time, social media was positioned as facilitating and driving forward these political movements. So social media as purely social, as essentially a social technology, and also essentially liberal, I argue, were our sentiments towards this technology back in 2010. Cracks were appearing in that edifice, principally through figures like Douglas Rushkoff. This is a wide article about one of the first times that he began to talk about, and this is a phrase that's been used a lot ever since, that with a social media platform, you are not just the customer or the user, you are the product. So there was an interest here in looking beneath the slick surface of the social interface to the economics, arguably not data yet, but the economics of how these systems work. Of course, there was academic criticism of some of those, some of the political ideology of Silicon Valley, principally figures like of Janie Morozov, who in this book, The Net Delusion, pointed out that social media could be used just as well by authoritarian regimes as it could be by democracies. So starting to pick apart some of the assumptions around these technologies. But arguably, it was two other events which raised the issues, the questions, and the concerns about data into mainstream public consciousness. Firstly, the Edward Snowden affair and the mass surveillance of citizenships through the data gleaned from social media and other services. And secondly, the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So public consciousness, I argue, about mass surveillance of data, but also the extent to which that surveillance allowed powerful organizations to begin to manipulate public opinion and arguably democracy through the algorithmic feedback of that data. And I think that's where we get to a point today where there is a greater awareness of, and you might not be able to see that image particularly well, this is a picture of a server farm, what's underneath the slick interfaces of social media, the data, as Shoshana Zuboff recently argued in her book on the age of surveillance capitalism, the idea that big tech companies have amassed world historic concentrations of knowledge and power, not just by collecting the data that everybody's leaving behind in these technologies, but using that data to manipulate the interfaces that we see. So just to recap, that's the understanding of data that I think has emerged over the previous 10 years that informs this term data justice. Let's move on to the other parts of the term justice. Given that situation of mass surveillance of data, of course, we are now starting to ask questions about what we do about it. And I think it's probably fair to say that justice is not the key term here that people tend to be using. It's that one, ethics. And particularly in relation to artificial intelligence, which is a broad catch-all term for a range of different technologies, techniques, processes, but in general refers to the ways that automated decision-making is being made using big data. And this is what a set of ethical principles looks like. And this is the key way that a mainstream way, I argue, that we are beginning to talk about the ethics of data and the ethics of AI. This is one produced by the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, by some researchers there, suggesting that the principles through which we deal with AI are privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, and the promotion of human values. And there are all sorts of areas now that have associated ethical principles, including, not least, education. This is the first framework produced specifically for education, at least in our current fascination with AI, by the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, which was based, now disbanded, interestingly, was based at the University of Buckingham, entitled The Ethical Framework for AI in Education. We can see the partners here were involved in co-producing that. And this document suggests some objectives for how we deal ethically with data and AI in education. They suggest achieving educational goals, an interest in forms of assessment, administration and workload, equity, autonomy, privacy, transparency and accountability, informed participation, and ethical design. Who would argue against those principles? Probably not many people. But in trying to define how a term like justice differentiates from ethics, I want to do a little bit of contesting the value and the worth of something like a set of ethical principles. And to do that really with two principal themes. Firstly, to suggest that, and I should say actually before this slide, that I'm sure most of us are aware that there has been a concern about the ethics washing around ethical principles. That is the idea that corporations take on ethical principles rather cynically as a way to avoid regulation. That is a key issue. I want to delve just a little bit beneath some of that critique to focus on the idea of principle making itself and to suggest some other ways we could think about it, thereby coming to what is going to be my definition of justice. So the first one is tech-centric. I argue that the principles around AI that we've seen put technology right in the center. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that AI across these principles tends to be positioned as both the cause and the solution ethical dilemmas. Let's look at an example. Privacy being one that features in almost all of the ethical principles and frameworks that have been published recently. So it seems to me that privacy is taken to be an important ethical principle because of the technology. Because the technology is there, it's collecting data, it's surveilling our everyday interactions on social media. Therefore, we need to now think about privacy. It's a cause of our ethical concern for privacy. Arguably, it's also proposed as a solution. We make this tech better, we can solve the problem of privacy. And this is indeed something that I've commented on recently in the reference at the bottom there, but also others suggesting across principle making that there is little engagement with the idea that data-driven technology can be limited or constrained. It placed as both the cause and solution for ethical dilemmas, principle making seems to be, in that sense, put in place to allow technology development to continue. And the second critique, the second way I want to challenge the idea of principle making is to talk about principles as ethical principles as attempting to be all-purpose, to define universal codes applicable across all contexts and through time. And that's particularly interesting given that most of the ethical principles I'll go on to talk about in a moment were defined before the current fascination with ChatGPT. And I wonder how many of them would still be the same, given this new form of generative AI that we are now talking about. This is a visualization produced by the same team at the Berkman Klein Center, a visualization of ethical principles that have been published. You probably can't see the detail on that slide, but that's kind of the point, because there's been a huge overabundance of ethical principles being published in recent years from intergovernmental organizations, governments, private sector, multi-stakeholder groups, civil society, and so on. And this visualization attempts to pull them all together into different sources and highlighting different themes. And indeed, this has been a key trend in research subsequently. There's so many ethical principles that we now need a research field to make sense of them. And this has happened with a number of groups, including the Berkman Klein group, distilling 36 different principle documents into 8 key themes, which I defined earlier. Another group, Jobin et al., suggesting 11 overarching themes. And Luciano Floridi and colleagues producing a unified framework. So attempting to define an ultimate set of principles that are relevant for every situation. So this is the shift that I want to try and emphasize that helps us to understand a data justice and a social justice position. A shift away from thinking about ethics as being tech-centric and towards being social justice-centric, and away from thinking about ethics as being rule-making that is all-purpose, and towards ethical thinking that is about context. Let me say a little bit more about that. Quoting Lena Densick, who is one of the key figures in this emerging idea of data justice from the Data Justice Lab in Cardiff. suggesting data justice as a framework for shifting the entry point and debate on data-related developments in a way that foregrounds social justice concerns and ongoing historical struggles against inequality, oppression, and domination. So let me just bring back the example that I used earlier to suggest that ethical principle making was tech-centric. So rather than something that immediately identifies an ideal like privacy, we might focus on some of the themes at the bottom of the slide there, which tend to be the way that we think about social justice concerns. So rather than thinking, well, the technology is collecting all this data, we now need to be concerned about privacy. Data justice encourages us to think, well, what are the already existing social justice issues in our contexts, and how does this technology maintain, overcome, or exacerbate those existing concerns? For example, social class, ethnicity, gender, citizenship, human rights. And I just want to end in the minute or so I've got left by giving you a key example of that. A lot of my work recently has been in the emergence of AI for education in China. What we're looking at on the slide is an image from a private learning center run by Squirrel AI, based in Shanghai, in China. We can see that there's a human teacher at the front of the classroom, as well as young people engaging one-to-one with the AI software that the company provides. It appears to be a relatively engaging, I would argue, classroom environment, but we might contrast it with this one, promoted by the very same company, using the very same software in a different school, a state school, and a school in a more rural area of China. And this is where we can start to ask, I think, important questions about the extent to which these technologies conform to, in some cases, even exacerbate existing inequalities. In China, it's well documented that rural areas struggle to retain qualified teachers, and we can infer here how these technologies, in standing in for that deficit, in a way that is intending to solve a problem, standing in for I should have said, in this picture, we can see that the classroom is well resourced. There's no human teacher in these images. So in standing in for the deficit of the teacher, it may well come to discourage the employment, the training, and the retention of human teachers in the future. And of course, in both these contexts, these young people are under immense societal pressure to do well in exams. As I say in my recent book on AI and education in China, AI and education appear to have coalesced at the pressure points of exam competition and fused along the fault lines of regional inequality. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Any questions from either our in-person or Teams audience?
Got one over here.
We've got one, yes.
So that's a great talk. What's the AI in the classroom? Is it teaching class?
It's the whole class teaching. So yeah, I was lucky enough to do a project collaborating with Square AI a year or so ago, and we did find this interesting use of AI in those private centers in the classroom with combinations. We often hear about AI being something that's enforces a one-to-one relationship between a young person and a screen. That does happen, but in those private learning centers, well resourced, there was clearly evidence that there was combinations of one-to-one and whole class teaching happening with a human teacher. But that was a well-resourced context, and it's clear in China and in other contexts there is a less well-resourced use of AI.
It may seem a strange question coming from a member of the project. You generally considerably talk about these things all the time, but I suppose it's this dilemma for me is kind of crystallised when you make the presentation, and it's just how you might feel about a
project like this, and it's kind of fellow travellers, as it were, adopting an unduly adversarial stance towards capitalism. It doesn't seem to me in the Western democracies that the citizenry is particularly hostile to capitalism. It seems to embrace it quite freely. It seems to support free enterprise. Yes, there does seem to be widespread concerns about inequality, but that's also accompanied by consumerism and lasting interest in making money. When we start to use words like domination, do we risk creating a polarisation with a broad section of the population whose support and consensus and participation we're going to need? And that would include maybe also the business community represented here, to produce the kind of citizenry of the future that we're looking for.
Absolutely, and I should say another strong aspect of my work is to try and understand participatory co-design. And we're going to hear more about that from other project partner Zhao later. So although as a researcher, I feel my job is to raise some of the critical issues. The critique that I try to work with is also opening avenues and opening doors to designing this kind of technology collaboratively and differently in the future. I think that I would argue that at the moment these kinds of technologies are categorizing education quite overwhelmingly in economic and positivist terms. I'm sure that lots of people may find that a good thing, but my interest is also in opening up the debates about how these technologies are designed to a broader audience who might have a different view about education. Education maybe being a bit more about democracy and a bit more about thinking about educational purpose and so on. Does that get to where you? Yeah.
We have one hand raised here. Hang on, if I can get hi. Sorry, hi Min Dai.
Yes, because I'm based in Shanghai, so I'm very interested in the example you presented, the Scroll AI. As I know, it is an adaptive learning platform. And because 2 years ago, China has a new policy that the private learning centers actually are no kind of banned in China because the education equality problems. So I'm not sure whether how is it going right now for the Scroll AI, and also I kind of mixed the point that are you trying to say that the AI actually is promoting equality or probably just weaken the educational equality? Because for Scroll AI is a very commercial organization. So there's of course those rich people in the cities, they can pay for that. And for the rural cities, for the rural places, and actually the government are using technology to support and address the issue that many teachers cannot retain in that places. So we have the phenomenon called one screen, because we're sharing that screen, and then students in the rural places, they can also listen to the classes probably located in Beijing. And this kind of the approach, they are trying to adjust the educational equality. So I kind of mixed the point in between.
Thank you very much. That's a really excellent question. I'll address the second bit first by saying, I think this is really important to emphasize for what I was trying to say in the talk is, what I'm interested in as a research question is how does AI fit into existing inequalities? And as you also said, I think one of the key inequalities in China is geographic difference between rural and urban areas. So I don't have an answer to that, but that's my interest. I want to investigate how these technologies overcome, perhaps, how they maintain or how they exacerbate that existing inequality between populations. I don't have a definitive answer to that, but it's something I'm exploring. Second part of the first part of your question, I should say, is a really good point as well. In my book, I address this in a much more detailed way. If you want to look at that, or ask your library to buy it. And the policy you're referring to became known as the double reduction. Well, that was the English term, Shengjian,
Yeah.
in China. And it was brought in essentially to stop private education in China making any money. And the key interest for me in that was my contention in the book that the development of AI in China is fundamentally linked to the private education sector. That's where most of the AI that we see in education was developed, through a private education that came from teaching people to pass exams and study English. Those are the populations and the economics that allowed AI for education to be developed through organizations like New Oriental, Tomorrow Advancing Life, and indeed Squirrel AI. What's happened as a result of that is fascinating. There's lots of things I could say, but one particularly interesting thing about Squirrel AI is because of the regulation to stop private education, Squirrel AI began to stop calling themselves an education company and began to call themselves a software as a service company. And they moved to a market. Well, they did two things. They part of, I argue, the double reduction policy was intended to send AI more into the state sector. Square AI have done that now. They publicized that they work with over 60,000 schools in China. But what they also did was develop a direct-to-consumer market where they started making hardware, things like iPads, with the software pre-installed. So rather than coming to and paying to come to a private learning center, they could buy a Square AI piece of kit and take it home, study AI at home. A completely unregulated market as a result of a government regulation.
A smart move for business.
But yeah, they're very smart, like many others, at responding to that.
Thank you.
I'll give you a question.
Thank you for explaining. Very interesting.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think one of the challenges that's really emerging from a lot of the discussions that we were having in breakout rooms and a lot of the presentations that we've seen so far is, to what extent is this a coherent project? And it's quite unsettling for me as the PI to be kind of asking that question. But to what extent are we talking about something that teachers can do within the classroom, teaching for digital citizenship? And to what extent is that constrained by some of these other issues around commercialization, platformization, the kind of structural inequalities that come kind of pre-evaluated to the classroom, with a lot of teachers feeling that there's not very much they can do about that because they're just given what they're given by various governments or school leadership. And I think this is a really important question. You know, how do we integrate the issues that we want schools to be considering in relation to their in relation to these wider digital justice structures, and teaching young people about their own future as digital citizens. I think one of the challenges at the moment is that it's very easy to sort of take these things piecemeal, as Jeremy was saying. And one of the things that we want to do through our co-design approach is to try to integrate these together in some way. And one of the ways that one example of a project that's sought to do that in the past comes from our next presenter, my colleague João Porto de Albuquerque, who is the co-director of the Urban Big Data Centre here at the University of Glasgow, who's going to talk to us about participatory co-creation, and particularly another project which brought together some quite distinct ethical issues, the waterproofing data project in Brazil. So one moment.
Thank you.
Hand over to you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you for attending our event today. I'm excited indeed to talk in this broad context of digital citizenship, as David was saying, bringing perhaps some perspectives from a different place and from the a whole set of different projects, but which I hope, and it's a hypothesis I want to explore with you today, will be useful for us to do teaching digital citizenship in the UK. So yeah, so João Porto de Albuquerque is this long name. You can call me just João or João. I come from a background in computer science, but I have worked as a social scientist and geographer. So explore this link between geographies and very strongly participatory geographies and participatory pedagogies for data. So a bit of background comes from what I'll be talking about here. I work at the Urban Big Data Center, which is both a data service and also a research center funded by the ESRC, as well as this project. And we have been exploring this, what I've been calling a participatory approach to urban analytics, or participatory urban analytics, trying to really look at urban data and how this could be brought with a form of citizen science that engages people with data. So this is just a bit of a background of where these talks come from, is speaking about these experiences that we're having across a number of projects in different countries, in Latin America, in Africa, and sometimes quite different type of ethics and justice questions, but also, I hope and think quite relevant today. So with these, I wanted to start by framing some of the challenges we tackled with these. Well, the first one key challenge we are seeing is redefining or rethinking citizenship or digital citizenship in the era of digital footprints. So that is the first thing. So UBDC is funded through the Digital Footprint Data Infrastructure by ESRC, which is the realization that we have a lot more data sources today. That is not the traditional, social science types of data, like the surveys, like the, administrative data. We have sensors, we have online and administrative systems, we have citizen-generated data in social media. All of this is designed for specific purposes, but it's also producing data increasingly and every day. And today, everyone here produces data. So that is the type of thing. How do we make sense of this data is one of the challenge, but also all of this availability of data and these traces that we leave when interacting today, what does that mean for citizenship? So this is one challenge. The second challenge, I think, is segue nicely from Jeremy's talk, is about justice and thinking about inequalities, and especially I bring this picture here, which you may have seen, is a picture from Sao Paulo, a city I'm quite familiar with in Brazil. It became kind of like a symbol of inequalities, because you're seeing two very contrasting inequalities in this picture. On the left-hand side, you have a favela, so a slum, and on the right-hand side, a very luxurious building where people have even pools in their balconies, So this is an actual place in Sao Paulo where these two things are meters apart, And the thing is that actually what I bring this to attention is that these existing inequalities, social spatial, social inequalities, they are associated with data inequalities. And that means with the availability and quality of data that we have. And indeed, we did some experiments about that and thinking about social media for flooding in Brazil. Well, just very briefly, this comes from a paper whose details I will not, explore here, but indeed shows that, we look at Sao Paulo, this is a map of Sao Paulo, and the blue shades on the left-hand side are income, concentration of income, You can see it's a very radio city with wealth and income concentrated in the center, you know. And the bubbles here represent the quality of data that you can get from social media regarding flooding, which is, you know, one of the topics of this talk. And it's quite striking that actually, you know, the bubbles are larger where the income is larger, you know. And then that means that, you know, if you use social media to look at rainfall and flooding, you're looking at the rainfall and flooding of the rich, but not the rainfall and flooding of the poor. And that is some of kind of like the way I used to motivate the talk to really discuss about, you know, inequalities and justice in a very practical way. They have practical consequences that, you know, that this data justice may be, you know, leading and perpetuating and exacerbating future inequalities as well. So the question I'd like to pose is this one: can we think about citizen science as an opportunity to develop critical data literacy, as well as generating data to fill some of those gaps and address some of the injustice in the data as well? So that is the question I would like to bring, and this has to do with this, you know, several different projects in which I've been engaging citizens in different places and in different ways with data. And in particular, I would like to talk about one project, which is the waterproofing data today. The waterproofing data was called like that as a provocation. You know, can we think about ways of making data waterproof? That means, you know, also using data to waterproof our societies, thinking that we have much more extreme weather events and floods are a recurrent problem in lots of places in the world. So we did this project and thinking about how to rethink flood data production, what flood data means and who produces it, who uses it, in order to transform resilience, but at the same time to rethink what data means. So critical data literacy at the same time as pairing with specific objectives, which here was flood resilience. So this was kind of like a large interdisciplinary project with partners in Germany, UK, and Brazil. I included the National Early Warning Center in Brazil, and a lot of cooperation partners funded by the Belmont Forum. And I will not go into the whole details of the project, but what I think the component which is very relevant for our discussion today was the component related to how to develop critical data literacy in classroom in Brazil in schools. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit more about. But first, we started by thinking in this project how to approach data and how to approach data from a pedagogical approach. So we took inspiration on the dialogic pedagogy of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian philosopher and educator, who wrote actually, you know, in the 70s, a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which became fairly influential in adult learning, as you may have heard. And we took the inspiration. Paulo Freire's main concern was with literacy, and with really kind of how to make literacy programs also a way of developing critical consciousness, you know, what he called conscientization. So we thought, well, we can actually think about data literacy in the same terms, that we need to have data literacy skills, but it's not about skills development, it's about thinking differently about the world. So Paulo Freire would say that read and write the word is at the same time you have to read and write the world. And then what we say is like, you know, reading and write the digital world is also reading and is what we need today. So like reading and write the data as reading and write the digital world. But Paulo Freire would call it a pedagogy of questions and not of, you know, depositing knowledge pre-made in the heads of subjects, but the students, but actually a co-construction, a co-design approach. And I think this is what we took as an inspiration to develop. How can we bring this to data? How can we do this with data, with this kind of like approach? And we developed what we called a dialogic way, you know, inspired by dialogic methods of Paulo Freire of dealing with that. Which we starts, you know, in the process that you can see in this diagram, starts with the situational analysis, grounded in the realities and the lived realities, which was the starting point to understand and think differently. We actually think about, in these realities, what data means. And then, you know, this is inspired, Paulo Freire will also start with the generative words that you should read and write not the words that I decide, but actually the words that are part of your life. And that was a way for really embedding literacy within the thinking. So that's what we start with data. It's generative in a quite different way than what generative AI is being discussed today. It's generative in the way that generative data is the one that has traction in the realities of people and engender new understandings and actions. And this is the basis for Paulo Freire for creating critical consciousness, conscientization, a word that he created, that would lead to identifying limit situations and then to really think about transformatory actions that that generate transformation pathways. So this is the approach we developed. So we are interested in how to embed this in the classroom, and that for this we develop a set of different ways of engaging people with data. That we use that dialogic approach from what we call a move from data gathering to data gardening, to a cultivation of data with people. And this embedded in different different methods. So we did participatory mapping, collaborative sketch mapping, and this generated data, created citizen science, did artistic installations, and in particular co-created with this a basis for school students and teachers to interact with data and to think differently about their own realities. That was kind of like the basis of our method. And with this led us to really see the opportunity to co-create a resource, a pedagogical resource, so similar to what we are interested in doing this project here, that would really, trigger this thinking and this way of interacting with data and bring students to critical reflection. So we developed with this a twofold approach. One mobile app based on this participatory design for the waterproofing data, which is a simple app, as you can see some screens here, for students to collect data themselves, so that they collect the data and they think about what data means, and they think about what flooding means. So the types of data here that we co-designed with them were data about rainfall measurements, that they will co-construct this plastic bottle rainfall gauges, and they will measure the rain and then record this rainfall in the app. So and also, for example, rainfall on the one hand, on the other hand, the impacts of rainfall, so the flooding events, and then that was the pedagogical approach, that if they start to see how much rain or how what is the rain measure that triggers which consequences. So there's thinking about what to do, and then there's also thinking about what is the data and why my data is not represented in the official media, for example, or what my floodings are not kind of like really visible, in the data, in the official data. So that is then what was our approach. We did this in co-production with seconded teachers in schools in Brazil, and so we took 21 what we called pollinators, which was the facilitators, which will bring the products of our gardens to other places in 5 Brazilian states, in 9 cities that you can see here in the map. Brazil is a huge place, so try to capture the diversity with this. And interestingly, we did a kind of like an intensive project with them in which we co-developed the app, validated the screen designs, and tested it in scale with students. And then we engaged more than 400 citizen scientists, both students, and also we worked with adult learning and lifelong learning, also with volunteers who were also part of the civil defense volunteers in the different cities. And then they generated, actually, they were quite successful in generating more than 7,000 reports and engaged a lot of schools and protection agencies, going beyond what we actually initially had. This is the map of their contribution. So you can see that, there is a concentration on the places we engaged initially, but, it went beyond that. So they conducted a number of activities with the school students, like you can see the pictures here, were picked up by the media quite prominently in Brazil because, it was a time in which there was a lot of flooding. And this data that the students generated was also synthesized and being used to understand the patterns of flooding for the National Early Warning Center. So we created the dashboard for them to be able to see it and to look at, in real time, still working, and they're still using it and there's more and more adoption at these days from it. So you can look at the different places, how much rainfall has been measured by the different students, compare with the official data, and the different patterns here in this city. So this was kind of like this result of this co-production process with them, and alongside the app we had teaching guide, teacher's guide, and then this was also co-produced with these teachers. This is now being used in several cities. It has been adopted as official result. But I wanted to tell one example of what I found particularly striking, of kind of like some of the impacts and the kind of like that we measured and did a lot of questionnaires and saw that there was a lot of efficiency in this. But one particular case study was very interesting, if not sad, because in one of the places we worked in the northeast of Brazil, there was some catastrophic flooding in May 2022. So after we worked with them, with a lot of deaths, as you can see here. But interestingly, we went back to see whether the app has been used, because it was exactly the place we have worked, not by chance, because we chose the flood-prone areas, So, and in fact, it has been used, and days before the flooding, these young people using the app have recorded very, very consistently the amounts of rainfall, even after our test. So they kept doing it, and they did put kind of like an alert. And when we interviewed the civil defense officer of the city, they said that actually because of the mobilization and the different type of consciousness they had, they actually alerted the community, who took some protective measures. They moved to safer grounds, and actually no one in that community we have worked died, in contrast to the other kind of like areas of the city. So in a way, that shows us that really kind of like this developing and applying to a real situation was kind of like working, and based on this fact, a lot of other schools and civil defenses got quite interested. It has been reported that in this particular case, the impact was very big. So that is the example I would like to bring, for us to think about embedding ethics and data justice in practice, and then bringing it back closer to the lived experiences of people. And that is kind of like my three key takeaway messages for today, really thinking about co-production of teaching resources, which in this case were a mobile app and teachers' guides, as an effective means for really thinking citizenship in a broader way that really, embeds people and grounding in the local needs and lived experiences. I think what this example shows is also that this engagement of school students in citizen science can help increase both their data literacy and critical awareness, but also really, have a practical, actions towards, addressing injustice, and then really filling gaps of the data that can be useful. So, and with this, the question I'm quite interested to explore with all of you in this Delphi, in this project, is really, can we think about the co-production process like this that responds to the experiences of UK school students? How can we work together, to co-produce, an approach like this? Thanks for that. I'll stop here. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks.
You want to?
Thanks very much, Joel. Any questions from the? Just get us back to the. Press leave by mistake. Sorry. Yes, we had some questions from here. Yeah. Hello.
And David, can I please ask you to repeat the question, because we can't really hear it very clearly here?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, and especially because of the volunteer flood board.
Oh, okay.
First, I wanted to ask you, this probably just for time, we didn't have, weren't able to elaborate on the feasible unseen's.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just elaborate.
Yeah, indeed.
So the question was about feasible unseens.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, that's one thing that from the pedagogy of Freire, I found it quite, yeah, thanks, quite striking and important, you know, for Paulo Freire, looking at limit situations and thinking critically about them would reveal new things. And these were the feasible unseens, things that you haven't seen before, but are feasible and are embedded in this. These are the transformatory pathways, you know, has been called also translated untested feasibility. But I prefer the term feasible unseens. I think it's closer to the original in Portuguese, that really, you know, is this idea that, you know, having a critical awareness of blockers and major limitations would enable us to really overcome them and then bring about things that we need to change them.
We've got a question from Kula.
Joao,
Yes.
thank you so much. Yes, hello. It's wonderful, and the projects that you have been describing are really wonderful. I think it's following really up on this, the feasible unseens that the colleague in the room has asked. So one of the things, I have been involved in co-production and co-creation of work myself, and one of the things that I'm kind of like thinking is what happens in our approaches when, of course, we raise awareness about inequalities that a specific group might have, when these might not lead to these transformative pathways. You know, it's actually being so aware about the inequalities that it might make things look not hopeful, you know, or the future look not hopeful. So what has been your, I guess my question is, what has been your pedagogic approach in these situations, whether you have seen this happening with the young people in Brazil, actually realizing that, you know, there are so many inequalities that, you know, they might feel that they're not kind of like in a position to actually take action.
Yes. No, thanks for that. That's a great question. And indeed, I think one of the key challenges of, you know, addressing injustice is really, you know, is this key components. Interestingly, in the work of Paulo Freire, you know, like his first book was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. When he wrote a retrospective 30 years later, he called it Pedagogy of Hope. Because really,
yes.
he said, like, it's essentially about hope. It's essentially about really, and that is the feasible unseens, which is, you know, when you address the root causes of injustice, you're creating hope to really improve the situation, you know. So, but of course, that starts by seeing the limit situations and calling them out, and then really kind of like, you know, identifying them. But it's always like, okay, we have to move from that step to the step of, okay, what can we do now to address this? You know, in my work, I've seen in different places working with people in situations of big injustice, for example, in flooding. And then, you know, one of the things I found quite striking is when people started to say, like, look, we are in a flood-prone area, but we are in you say we are a high-risk area, but actually we are in a high-cost area. Actually, you can actually do measures to improve our life here, you know. And then people start to say, like, look, how can we demand this action from the government, you know, to happen, you know. And indeed, with the measurements, they can document that, they can generate data that can really kind of like use for it, you know. And they say, like, okay, no, now we have data, we can show that even if a light rain, you know, this is flooding every time, and we will have recorded this, you know, in the past year, and can demand action from and advocate for improvements, you know. So that was one of the issue of hope, and I think that's quite important, really, to come back to the to addressing injustice as a means of hoping, and then of really, you know, addressing this or looking for the feasible unseens as really the horizon of what we want to do as educators.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes, Jim.
John, thank you very much. I'm sorry for being a member of the team asking questions, but nevertheless, I think one of the really interesting interfaces is between the students doing this work and the government.
Yeah.
And similarly, Brad and I were having a conversation last night about how you influence big organizations like Google. And how can, because in the end, you know, big tech organizations are going to shape a lot of this, whether you like it or you don't like it, it's irrelevant. And I like their emphasis on hope, because I think that's really important. It has to be positive. But how do you think we should begin to think about the relationship between these educational entailments and the kinds of activities that go on in large-scale tech companies?
That's a good question. Yeah, indeed. I think, you know, having hope and wanting to address is not to deny the fact that we have different hierarchies and different, power underlines this, and differential is in power, including the power to shape the technology, isn't it? So I do think that, you know, one of the things that in my practice that has to do with this interface with big tech companies perhaps is really to recognize, really, you know, sometimes being aware of how much our experience is already being shaped by, you know, by some of this, you know, and who has agency and really kind of like shaping those experiences, really. So I think that's just the first step, isn't it? So I think, you know, I don't have an answer on, you know, how do we influence that. I think indeed we have to be much more critically aware of what is already ongoing and shaping our current experiences, so that we can, you know, devise those pathways. And then they might have to do with regulation. They might have to do with a lot of working together as well to make some things more transparent, you know, in some of the ways the technology is working or not working today as well.
I mean, maybe it's to do with how we think about these things at this stage, rather than what we do. And we have to really change how we think about the relationship between business, technology, and education.
Yes.
So we not need to move. We not need to move from a degree of culture to fear.
Yeah.
I mean, this is at the early start, and I'm very new to this, so I don't speak out of turn, but when I listen to the presentations, the questions that have been asked, and the points that have been made, many of them are about threats and what we don't want. Talk about hope. We can only, I think, create hope in all of this by looking at opportunity, at least as equally as we look at threats.
Yeah.
And that's not. I attended a conference on Thursday, and a similar kind of culture. We're very concerned with threats. And hope, I think, can only come if we're prepared to shape what we want. To do that, we're going to say what we want.
Yeah.
The technology companies, we can create hope by telling the technology companies what we want. And I think we're far too slow in doing that. And the technology is coming very, very fast.
Yeah.
And we need to start talking and getting the public on board. We need to speak a language that people can understand.
Sorry, just for the benefit of those online, the comment was that we need to move away from a culture of fear and threat towards making a more proactive sense of what we want, towards hope rather than just fear, which I completely agree with.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you. I think in a way, you know, that is the, you know, looking at the issues and the blockers we have today is just the first step. We have to really envisage what we want, and that is really, I think, very in line to what you say. So it's really imagine how we address those injustice, you know, and that has to come back to our lives, you know, and that is the approach, you know, that we've been trying to do, is like, you know, how do we come from a situation of fatalism, and that's, you know, that's similar with flooding and with, you know, with digital platforms today. Oh, I have to give my data away. I have no other way. I want to use it anyway, and then I have to give my data away. I know that they are making money with that. I know that they are using algorithms manipulating my behavior, but, you know, I have to use it. I want to use it, and okay, whatever. So that is a position of, you know, of conformism and fatalism. And how do we move from that to a position of, okay, I want to proactively shape that, understanding first, thinking differently of what there is, and then reimagining what the relationship could be at a new one.
Can I just add in there as well that I think one of the starting points for getting towards what we want is we need to know what we have and how it functions. I think the kind of data gathering that the Waterproofing Data Project did around just finding out where these data inequalities were in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, about the reporting of flooding, the reporting through social media. Actually knowing what we have is a first step. So mapping the state of the sector from teachers, from policymakers, about what kind of platforms schools are using, about to what extent teachers and students are aware of how they're giving away their data, what kind of data is being collected about them, and to what end. They need to have some awareness of that in order to even begin to co-construct the sense of what do we want to turn it into. I think very often we tend to see these things as kind of inevitable, that we just have to think things are seen as given. You know, a lot of the structures are taken as a given, that we have to use this structure, we have to use this platform, we have to use Teams. Someone sent us a Teams link, we have to use Teams, and that's just what we have to do. And there isn't a lot of thought into what we would like it to be. You know, I think very often we're just presented with things, and there's a sense as well for education that beggars can't be choosers. You know, that we're using software, that education is essentially a free rider on platforms like Teams, which are designed for business. You know, they're designed for business clients, and education is by and large a free rider on that. And therefore we're kind of working with the affordances, something that was designed for a completely different kind of process as well. Sorry, I'm retreating into fatalism, which I want to avoid doing.
Well, I to some extent disagree with you, because I think what we have isn't necessarily all that relevant to where we're going. I think this technology is going to be so disruptive that if we are focused on what we have, we'll drag too much baggage with us to be light enough to match the pace of technological development. So I think that spending a lot of time analysing what we have now is inefficient use of our time. We're facing potentially a cataclysm in the future. We need to be really quick, light on our feet, what we can, and we can do that positively, and should do that positively. We need to have a vision.
Yeah.
We need to put things in context of how the future is likely to be, because it's not going to be like today.
Yeah.
And hopefully, over the next couple of days, we can start to address some of those things.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Are there any further comments, questions from our online audience?
David, can I ask something about, because you started this session with the example of the exams fiasco, really, in the UK, you know, and kind of like algorithms really surfacing all these biases. And that was a really hopeful example because there was reaction to that. And then, you know, authorities had to change how these assessments were done, you know, for young people. What do you think made that happen?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. What made it happen? I think an element of political will, but also an element of the newness of this. This was a new, a short-term solution using an algorithm to replace something that hadn't been done algorithmically at all previously. Well, actually it had, but hadn't been explicitly done algorithmically. There are things that Pearson and Cambridge Assessment do that involves an element of algorithmic scaling. But I think the newness of it and the fact that you could just say, well, let's just take this technology away again and see what happens now, which is essentially what happened. It wasn't that the SQA in Scotland and the exam boards in England didn't say, oh, we'll go back and revise our algorithm and make it more just. They just said, well, we'll get rid of the algorithm and just go on teacher assessment. I think that made it much easier. That we knew what the structure was. You know, we knew which aspects of this were technological and which aspects were based on human judgment, and it was possible to say, well, we'll just take the technology away and go back to human judgment. So in some ways, I think it's hopeful, but it's also a bit of a Luddite solution as well, and I'm not interested in presenting Luddite solutions. I'm interested in how can we create a more just digital
algorithms,
citizenship for the future.
But do you think it's also because that injustice was felt by so many that actually it prompted that kind of like reaction back, you know, because it was felt by people who maybe normally they don't feel this injustice?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
David,
There's another question.
In relation to questions we discussed in the breakout rooms about how far these dilemmas amplify pre-existing dilemmas, and that is a really good example, because while it's true that there was manifest injustice across the 4 nations and the implementation of these algorithms, remember what the motivations were. That the shift to teacher-based assessment opened up a whole well-documented and long research minefield of teacher overestimation of grades, of teacher biases affecting gender, ethnicity, region, class. So it's not as if there was a pre-Lapsarian assessment paradise that suddenly got contaminated by the original sin of the algorithm. We need to keep that in mind when we deliberate the Hayward report, which is in suspended animation, because the pre-existing inclination to go to more teacher-based assessment has opened up this other minefield of cheating and chat GPTing through your folio pieces.
Thanks. I have a comment from Sally as well.
Hi, yes, actually, Bob just sort of said something that I was going to say, but I'll just make one very quick comment because I realise we're getting short of time now. I'm quite interested in what you've raised this morning, actually, the whole package of this impact of digital, the explosion of digital sort of acumen. How do you think teachers and teacher educators should cope with it? There's a lot in there, isn't there? I know it's at early days in your project, but do you have any messages now for teachers and teacher educators on how to approach this, how to think about it, or would we be better to just bide our time and wait until things unfold and people with a lot more expertise like yourselves can give us some concrete sort of answers and solutions?
Certainly don't wait for me to give you any kind of answers. The whole point of this is that it's a co-production project. So we want to hear from teachers. We want to hear from teacher educators. I don't have any magic bullet solutions at this point. What I do think is important is attentiveness to the structural conditions of digital citizenship. So as Jeremy was saying, this framing of digital ethics is really important. It is important to talk about personal responsibility and how young people can keep themselves safe online, how they can keep themselves safe from radicalization, how they can keep themselves safe from predators and exploitation. But it's also important to take a step back from that and to look at the structural conditions that make those kinds of threats so prevalent online in the first place. So as well as the kind of immediate safeguarding threats, which I think teachers are doing, at least based on our initial sort of conversations and pilot survey, teachers are very aware of those kinds of threats, but also taking a step back and thinking about what are the structural conditions that make those threats a particular challenge, and that make them a particular challenge for certain groups of students more than others. You know, there are issues surrounding the kinds of content that people are exposed to, and the way that exacerbates, you know, existing inequalities. Taking the time to think about those issues, taking the time to talk to students about them. I think the other thing is that where there are data injustices and data inequalities within the life of the school, so you know, teachers are drowning in data reporting requirements, there's every reason that that can also be a curriculum topic. You know, there's every reason, just as if we're talking about safeguarding, if we're talking about radicalization, as well as having a duty of reporting, we can have a duty to talk to students and to reflect on those things in the classroom. We can equally have an opportunity to reflect on those things with young people, encourage them to reflect on them.
Thank you, David.
It is just worth saying in the group as Gula, Heather, and others, we were talking about.
Do you want
to Andrew's point?
If you're able to, it's just easier.
One of the issues we were talking about in our group was the need to reconceptualize what we mean about the digital world and the material world. We have, you know, when I go to bed at night and I take out my book, I take out an object. If I take out my iPad, I take out an object. I engage with the book, I engage with the iPad. The idea that there's a digital world and then a material culture world is one of the besetting problems here. There is the world, and the world is constantly changing, and the technologies are constantly changing, whether it's fire or print or digitalization. And we have to think completely differently about the material and culture world and the digital world, and stop seeing them as two different kinds of things. And then we will have some opportunity to think how we live with the technology as part of our world, not as something anterior to or separate from the world. So I do think it is about reframing, in Andrew's terms, the conversation. And the more this conversation has gone on, the more persuaded I am about the wrongness of some of my own ideas, but also the rightness of one key issue, which is that the capacities we have always needed to live in the world will still be the same capacities, which are the capacities of discernment, discrimination, and judgment. So just wanted to add that bit in.
Thank you.
By removing harms or risks of threats, etc., on social media, on its video share, we talk about what behaviours, the levels. It's one of the key things. If you can explore it through those lenses, then you start to pick apart. For example, grooming is not a challenge or a threat on watching the video online. Watching YouTube isn't really going to bring that risk. So try your teachers to pick it apart, unpack it, start to understand it, and that helps you get an answer. I think we do the same with the wider digital literacy, digital citizenship. And I think we need, what I think referring to that is our rocks in the river. We keep hearing from teachers and educators, it's always changing. The landscape's so fluid, with new apps, new devices, and that's irrelevant. I think if you go way back to ARPANET, it was about sharing documents and files online, being able to communicate with other people. Web 2.0 probably brought about more of GA because of the technology catching up, but the actual use of the internet and then the web has been more or less communicated for 60, 70 years now. And it hasn't changed that much. Some of what we do changes, but we found that's really effective in the support we provide educators, work with them to say, once you start to understand this, it's not about, is it TikTok, or is it YouTube? It's about how they're behaving, and it's made it a lot clearer for us to get guidance. And see educators start to use it more and say, I'm at least clearer that I don't need to know 10 apps, I need to understand how they communicate or consume. Yeah. So I think we can get something like that for this one. Principles and pillars that can say these are probably unlikely to change. Stuff will change around them. I suppose for me, pedagogy probably goes back to how you scaffold deliver in NSS, and AI and things will just change the modality of it. It's not going to change the principles of scaffolding learners and then assessing them to provide feedback. That probably still be there, but the modality will change. So I think that those are something which you can certainly hope to work towards. So I would hope to think.
Thank you. Sorry, I realised that those online probably can't hear in too much detail, but just saying that the modalities and the technologies change, but these capacities and these principles are more stable. I should probably hand over now to Sally and to Kula, and just to say thank you very much for giving us the time to talk about these issues, and we're really happy to have an audience through BERA to explore this with, but we really want you to be more than just an audience, and please do keep in touch, and yeah, please do get in touch with us if you would like to be involved with our ongoing work.
Thank you, David. And I'd just like to say on behalf of Kula from the EdTech Special Interest Group, and Heather and myself on behalf of the Religion, Values and Education Special Interest Group from BERA, we'd just like to say a huge thank you to you, David, and to all the others who've been speaking this morning and early afternoon, to Zhao, to Lee, Jeremy. It's been fascinating, very, very interesting, very stimulating. You've provided us both us online and also those of you who are live, and I'm sure you'll carry on talking for a little while longer when we've left you. You've provided us with an interesting and very important workshop with keynotes on digital literacy for citizenship. You've raised lots of questions, particularly about justice and ethics and so on, and just trying to help us scope the wider picture, because it is a big picture, very complex. And thank you for doing that. We look forward to hearing more from your project. Certainly, you're absolutely right, David. We would love to hear more from you and your team in future BERA events, both single ones like this, joint SIG events, and also at our conference that we have yearly in September. So thank you, all of you. It's been fabulous. And thank you to the audiences, both online and physical. I think you've done incredibly well actually doing this sort of hybrid session. I think it's worked fine, actually. It's been really exciting and really, really good. So we on the online community will be leaving you now, but thank you once again, and we look forward to more in the future.